With an apology, apparently there are two buildings at the university called Mandel. So whomever went in the morning to a different building, I'm happy you're here. Whomever is still at a different building, I'm sorry. Hope you find your way somehow and sometime. I also want to say another thing. This is for Pnina and for some other people. I'm sitting here today with two hats on. One hat that I will shortly speak about, but the other hat is that of a policewoman. I promise no one is going to be entering here with coffee or food. So I'll just say, you'll have a break to drink outside, you're okay.
It's tea, it's not coffee.
Oh, that's... No, I'm just going to say, whomever spills at 3 p.m. stays with us to clean the room. So as long as we have that set between us, we're good. You don't have any flights to catch or anything?
No, I can do my cleaning duty.
In any case, I'm never riding home today.
So it seems I'm doing the tidying. Okay.
Okay. So welcome everyone. I'm very happy to see everyone that's here, and some faces that I'm quite familiar with, and a few faces that I'm less familiar with. So I'm happy to see you, and we hope we have a time to chat afterwards outside and to meet with people that I'm less familiar with. Those of you that were with us yesterday, I'm very happy to see you again, and I think we had some wonderful talks. Those of you that weren't here yesterday, of course, as always, everything was videotaped, and you can see that online afterwards. And happy for those of you who joined us today. This is a very good question. I'm speaking to myself without anyone writing. So our day yesterday focused on the way in which disability studies and social models of disabilities influence professionals, and we had focused on different types of professionals, and I thought that was very interesting. But today we're making a shift towards research, because I think that disability studies and social models, of course, have a lot of influence on the research that we as researchers conduct, and it was very important for us to keep this day, and we had a lot of fights over this, I know, but I think the fights were worth it because we wanted to keep this day really small as we could, so that we'll have an opportunity for a discussion and really speaking about the issues that most of us deal with, either if we're already applying research and we're working as researchers, or we have a lot of people here that are master's students, PhD students, and are thinking about these issues, and it was really important for us to keep the group small. So just a bit before I go on to what we're expecting today, I did want to give a bit of background on the Center for Disability Studies. I assume most people here are quite familiar with the center, and those who are not, come talk to me. But I did want to put this into context. So the Center for Disability Studies opened October of 2016. And it is a joint venture between the School of Social Work at Hebrew U and Israel Unlimited, JDC, Ruderman Family Foundation, and the Israeli government. The center is based on the philosophical framework of the social model of disability, understanding that impairment is not equal to disability, but rather impairment relates to a specific bodily dysfunction. When we talk about disability, we're talking about multifaceted concept that is deeply influenced by society, by environmental, cultural, political forces. We're using this perspective actually in all of our work and ideology of what we're doing at our center, in trying to advance the existing knowledge, research, services in a way that will be compliant with social perspective to disabilities, and in trying to bring together enhanced quality of life and well-being and community participation for persons in society. We have different activities within the center around the school year, including various talks that are open to professionals and to persons in the public, conferences, research meetings, and a lot of other things. And if anyone is interested in more knowledge, of course, you can always welcome to go into our website and Facebook and follow the things that we're doing. There's also brochures up here, if anyone didn't get them. One brochure that has what is the plan for today, and the other brochure about the center for anyone who's interested, so you can see this. So, what do we have planned for today in terms of the research workshop? I think when we're focusing and we're speaking about disability studies and we're speaking about social models of disability, and again yesterday we spoke of how it influences the professionals, but I think that another important pillar of work is everything that has to do with research. And promoting research that is based within disability studies is really very, very important. And we see this as an important part of our work at the center. We put quite a lot of time in trying to speak with our master's students, PhD students. We have, sitting right across from me, one of our fellows who received funding from the center. The second one is missing, but she was here yesterday. And we also give some research grants to postdoctoral work at VAC, sitting here also have received some funding for her really, really exciting research she's doing in Amsterdam. So really this is an important part of some of the things that we do. And I think also the last talk that will be here today, a little bit later today, is another pillar of research that we're trying to advance more and more with our colleagues at Easy, that has to do with inclusive research and collaborative research, and a lot of the topics that we'll speak about today will be along those lines also of a collaborative research. So putting this into context, I think I want us throughout all the talks that will be today to keep on the back of our minds a few questions that we might want to investigate along the way. And how do we see ourselves when we ask ourselves, how do we construct and implement research that is based on the principles of disability studies? How do we learn from research results in order to advance knowledge for the field? You might see, those of you who have looked at the program, that we're going to be having 4 quite different topics, quite different lectures, and I think they're really very distinct in terms of what they cover. But then there are also some similarities between them that I want us to investigate. Also the differences and also the similarities between them. Where is the voice of persons with disabilities within the different research? How is the researcher implementing him or herself when they go in? How do they see their ideology? How do they step into the research? What is the purpose of research that is based within disability studies? Is it different than any other type of research? What is the a priori thought in which the researcher comes into this idea? And how can we examine the different challenges, the different dilemmas that rise across the way? Tom said in his talk yesterday that disability is complex. I tend to agree very much. And along those lines, I would also say that research in disabilities, and specifically research in disability studies, is very complex. So let us think of these different topics, and I'm just sort of throwing in your way different thoughts that came to my mind, that things we can think about, but of course you can feel free to think about anything else. How does disability studies influence the research questions that we ask? Are there research questions that are appropriate for disability studies and others that might look at a different perspective? What are the aims of the studies that are based within disability studies ideology in terms of the research itself, in terms of implementing the results? How do disability studies influence the different stages of the study? And I'm looking at the entire process. What questions do we ask? What methods do we use? How do we analyze the results? What do we bring into the discussion? Where do we take the results in the discussion in terms of disseminating our research results, and how do we bring them? What influence will it have on policymakers, on legislation, on others in the field, in the community? Making change, I think one of the most important things for people who are in disability studies is seeing some change come across. So how do we do this? I'm sure you will ask many other questions along the way, and all of those are appropriate, and we will keep them in the back of my mind, and we'll try to discuss this. We'll have quite a few breaks, and I hope this will give people some time to socialize, to speak between themselves, but when we ask you to come back, please do come back. And that way you would also have time for your coffee and everything else like that for all of you that are still craving for that coffee. As we have said before, the entire day is going to be in English, but I do want to say that if anyone feels more comfortable asking a question in Hebrew, speaking in Hebrew, don't hesitate, don't feel shy to raise your hand and speak whatever language you feel appropriate with, and we will do the translation if necessary. So. Oh, okay. For the speakers who are up here, please speak to the FM, and for speakers that are here and you want to ask a question, we will be distributing the mic. This is for Adva to be able to hear with her FM, so please do, when you feel an urge to speak, raise your hand and use the mic before you speak. I'm sort of debating if we have time for a roundabout just by name or not. No.
People say name and name.
Okay.
People introduce themselves.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll do, whenever you say something, then you introduce yourself and say your names, and that way we'll get to know everyone. So I do want to say thank you to our guests that are here, and I'll introduce each one of you when I get to you. I do want to say thank you for the people that were behind the work here in order to make this day happen. So of course Efrat, who is not even sitting here because she's still either working on getting people coming or on other things that she's been doing. She's put a lot of work on this day. Mu'tasam and Aviv within our staff at the School of Social Work, and all of our staff in the School of Social Work who was very helpful, and our partners, of course, at Israel Unlimited, who are not with us today but were part of all the plans. Does anyone have any technical question or anything like along those lines? Okay. So,
You don't need to say anything.
what?
You don't need to introduce me.
No. Are you going to do that? So I'm passing over the mic to Professor Tom Shakespeare, and he'll do his introductions. Do you want me to sit by the...
Thank you. No, it's fine. I can reach out. Now, I think everybody knows me from yesterday. So I'm a sociologist. I'm at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. We do disability and development work. Our centre, International Centre on Evidence on Disability. And over the last 30 years, I've been teaching, researching, and also being an activist. So, yeah, I'll just go, and if you have a query, then you can stop me, or we can talk at the end. So, this is the overview of what I want to talk about. I want to say some general things, some of which I could probably fast forward through, because I probably said them yesterday. But I want to talk a little bit about a research study we did. I've done various research studies, one with disabled children, one on sexuality and disability, one on life with restricted growth, one on success in Africa, and I've been involved in studies on recovery, mental health recovery, all qualitative studies. I think that it's really important to ask disabled people, people with mental illness, people with other conditions, about their lives, and to really see them in their entirety. I know that a study may only look at one aspect, but I think it could look at different aspects, and I think we should understand the richness and the diversity of disabled people's lives. So this is Antonio Gramsci, Italian Marxist. I should say I'm not a Marxist, but I'm very influenced by his work. Gramsci talked about different sorts of intellectuals. He talked about bourgeois intellectuals, and he talked about organic intellectuals. And organic intellectuals come from the movement. In his case, it was the labour movement. But in our case, it's disabled people. And I think that we need to build bridges, we need to have ramps to get disabled people into the academy. So what we do is wonderful, But the end point should be that in this room there are equal numbers of disabled people and non-disabled people. And so we have some ways to go. Here, and in the UK, and in the US, and in the Nordic countries, we all have some way to go. And one of the things we're trying to do in Africa is to enable disabled African researchers. We have African researchers, but they're not disabled. So we need to build that ramp into the academy. So just to say that. So I don't think I need to say much about this because we talked about it yesterday. I do want to say that there was all sorts of disabled people's groups in the 70s and 80s. There was a pluralism. There were different approaches because disabled people are diverse and different. And through that, we've had a consistent thread of thinking, those organic intellectuals thinking about disability. And these are some of the themes of that. We've talked about the social model and the medical model. This idea of rights, not charity, that we could move to a human rights approach with a convention, that we need disabled people's organisations, not organisations for disabled people. The third thing, and the third big idea, is talking about independent living, researching that. We just finished a big research project on the relationship between disabled people and their support workers, and how that could go well. So, conceptualising it, and also digging deeper. I think that the disability movement is very good at coming up with the core idea that we always need to dig deeper. It's always more complicated. There is always subtlety, which is missed because the slogan is not the same as an academic discourse. And finally, nothing about us without us, which comes back to this notion of organic intellectuals. It comes to the idea of co-production. This concept, we have co-production of services, we should have co-production of research. So the study we'll talk about in a minute was done with the Disabled People's Organisation. And whether it's a formal relationship with the Disabled People's Organisation, or whether there are advisors, or whether you go out and you ask people what they want you to research first, and then go and do it, and then go back to them and say, this is what we found. I think that the researcher has got a really interesting role. She needs to be independent because she needs to ask difficult questions. I remember once a colleague of mine had a research project and it was called, a long title, something like, why services run by disabled people's organisations are better than services run by the mainstream. And I said, you've titled it that? He said, yeah. I said, but how do you know it's true? Surely you need to find out whether. Because we cannot assume anything. We cannot assume we're right, we cannot assume we're better, we cannot assume this is the best way to go. It probably is, it might be, who knows? But when we're researchers, we're not activists. Research is not activism by other means. To be effective, it needs to be independent, as objective as possible, you never put it totally objective. But if we don't get that right, we won't be able to challenge our own people. And we do need to challenge them, because they don't always get it right. So there's a difference between nothing about us without us, and we're just going to do what you tell us. Because otherwise, why bother being an academic? Why bother being an independent thinker? Now, I'm glad if we come up with the same thing and give evidence for what we already know. That's fine. But sometimes we're going to challenge it. I just want to give you one example. Should you teach small children to swim to save them from drowning? Yeah, sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Teach small children to swim, they're not going to drown. Wrong. Wrong. If you teach children under 5 to swim, they are more likely to drown. Yeah? So it's counterintuitive. You all thought you knew that it was good. It's not good. Because if you teach small children to swim, they go and swim. And when they go and swim, they get into difficulties. And they're more likely to drown. They're not good at controlling their breathing. They get out of water, out of depth, and then they drown. So the best thing is to stop them from swimming until they're old enough to do it well, and to be taught properly, and to survive. Do you see what I'm saying? It's totally counterintuitive, but that's what the World Report on Child Injury found at the World Health Organization. So, don't assume you know. We might not know. So, the disability research was there at the start. The Le Court Cheshire Home, which is where UPIAS really initiated with Paul Hunt and people like that, they asked, there was a residence committee with people like Paul Hunt and others, and they asked academics from the Tavistock in to research them. And they came and they interviewed and they observed, and they went away and they had this concept. These people are socially dead, and they're being warehoused till they're physically dead. And there are different sorts of warehousing. There's a horticultural model, and the people at the home were outraged. They didn't expect that. And that's why Paul Hunt wrote this very important document, setting accounts with the parasite people. So at the start of the UK, the UPIAS that we've heard about, the social model that we've heard about, is a rejection of non-disabled academics coming and thinking they know best. So that tension has gone through, and there is a suspicion of research. You don't know any better than we do. So that's what I think that was a bad start, because I think that we need a dialectic where we each inform the other, but we're each independent of each other. So Colin at Leeds came up with the evidence for discrimination. The government, the MPs were saying, no, disabled people aren't discriminated against, we're very nice to them. Colin marshalled all the evidence, published a book, and after that book it was impossible to say that disabled people were not discriminated against. And that was a real step forward in the struggle for anti-discrimination legislation. So academia played an important role. And then Colin and Vic and Mike and others conceptualized emancipatory research. And I think, I mean, I may be corrected by Hannah and Angharan or others, it has to follow the social model, disabled people's organisations have to be in control, there has to be a commitment to empowerment of disabled people. Those seem to be the three, whatever the word is, features of emancipatory research. And then we've had the wonderful series of disability studies conferences at Lancaster, and I want to pay tribute to Hannah Morgan, who has stalwartly, heroically kept these going, and we all owe her a big, big debt. A journal is important, but a conference when we come together is vital. So, I'm not sure I've done much emancipatory research, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think we need emancipatory research, but it's not the only tool in the box. We heard yesterday that wonderful quotation from Mike Oliver. If I had a hammer, he said, the social model is your hammer. And I remember him saying that. I'm not sure whether it was for the first time. And my reply to him was this. There's an English saying, if you give a man a hammer, all he sees is nails. And I think that's the other side of it. It is a hammer, it is a tool, but there are other tools in the box. So, for example, there's lots of other traditions of UK academic research which don't fit quite so well within the social model of emancipatory research toolbox. Rather, there are other tools in the box. They don't always talk to each other. There is value in the chronic illness work of Mike Oliver, Mike Berry, Gareth Williams, Simon Williams, Ruth Pinder. Gareth sadly died last year. There is value there, because they're going to talk to disabled people. They're asking them about their lives. They're finding out things which are important about the experience of illness in particular. There's a whole social policy tradition. People at the Social Policy Research Unit at York, people at London School of Economics. This is not emancipatory research. This is not the disability movement, but it's damn vital in establishing the poverty of disabled people and all the rest of it. And I think we've gone beyond the idea that these are competing. They're different tools in a box. All the work with people with learning difficulties, who often have rejected the social model and said, look, we're going to do it slightly differently. And then the mental health work, the recovery work. Peter Beresford is working in the social model tradition, but others aren't. And then there's deaf studies, which sadly at Bristol has faded because of lack of support. So I want to say there are other approaches. And I've written that within disability studies, that and you as disability researchers need to think about this, there are different perspectives, and that's fine. That's okay. We need the debate. So I don't know if this is right. You tell me if you think it's wrong. There's sort of materialist approach, which is very Marxist and inspiration at any rate. There's the critical disability studies, which often is very much more theoretical and cultural, challenges dichotomies. looks at disableism and ableism. And then you could call, critical realist disability studies, people like me. Now, I wrote this, so you could disagree with it. You say, oh, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, Tom? But my point is, whether this is exactly right or not doesn't matter. The point is there are different traditions, and that's okay. We're allowed it. We can debate it. It's not one thing. There's probably lots of other things that I haven't included. And then what's wonderful is this growth of disability studies. And this is not exhaustive. There's disability studies in Israel and in Turkey and in many in Africa and many countries. And there's all these journals, growing. Now, what I want to say to you though is that we've got to be careful. Because if you look at all of the emancipatory traditions of research, they started out being very closely allied to movements. So Marxism, allied to a movement. And then the movement is defeated, and Marxism goes into the academy. And you can see it with Lukács or all of these things in the Marxist tradition, Western Marxism, or rest of it. Feminism, very radical challenge to women's movement in the 60s, 70s. And then it runs into obstacles, the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment, or whatever it might be. And where does feminism go? Into the academy. And LGBT work, still campaigning. Feminism obviously is still campaigning, but there's this tendency, it's easier to make a living, to make a contribution, to write a book, than it is to change the world. And what I'm not against feminist research, Marxist theory, LGBT theory. I'm for it. It's great. It's interesting. We want to read it. But we mustn't think that that is still the core. The core is changing the world. And I think we need to be careful as disability researchers. Yes, we want to build a discipline. Yes, we want a professor. Yes, we want a journal. Yes, we want to get tenure. But the point, as Gramsci would say, is to change the world. As my Oliver would say, as Colin Barnes would say, as Carol Thomas would say, as we all would say. We all agree on that, to make the world a better place. Now, yesterday I gave you my little, whatever you call it, aid memoir. You could have done it in another way, because in critical realist approaches, there's this idea of a laminated model. Have you come across this? You know what laminated is? It's layers. Yeah? This is not proper wood. There's some chipboard underneath. It's laminated with pine. Yeah? So laminated is just literally layers. And what the critical realists want to say is that you've got a bottom layer, you call that genetics or something like that, or molecules. So I have a G to A transposition of 0.38 of my FGFR3 gene. That's true. That's right. Doesn't explain me, but it is something I have. So you've got the genetic level, you've got the physiological level, whatever. There's at least one clinician in this room. She can tell us about our functioning. And you've got psychological, you've got environmental, you've got social relations, you've got economic and educational opportunities, you've got the legal status, you've got cultural. I'm not going to argue with you what layers we've got. But we have all these layers, don't we? They're all, and you as human beings. Some of you have got 2X chromosomes, some of you have got XY chromosomes, goodness knows the rest of us. But, that defines you, but also your gender is a social thing, and so forth. Do you know what I mean? And we go to the right person. We don't go to see Judith Butler for pregnancy or menopause. That would be a wrong move. Yeah? We don't go to see Mike Oliver when we've got neuropathic pain. That's just not, it's not going to help you. But we do need help with that. We do need to understand it. We do need to, maybe you need to theorize it. And that's okay. We have these different levels. Now the danger is when you confuse one level for the other levels. So if you've got fundamental, if women are not paid equally with men, the last place they should go to is a bloody gynecologist. Yeah? That's not the problem, that they have XX chromosome. Yeah? And similarly for disabled people. If we want to know why we experience violence, it's not because we can't walk, or whatever it is. Yeah? So we go to the right level. And fundamentally there are problems when we go to the wrong level. It's not that we're not XX or paraplegic or whatever it is, it's just it's not the relevant level of analysis. But depending on the questions you ask, you go through different levels. So I wanted to talk about this study for a couple of reasons. So first of all, it was a collaboration between me, a social scientist, and my colleague who is a geneticist. You don't get much more medical than a clinical geneticist. He can tell me about my G to A transposition of 0.38 to my FGFR3 gene. He could take all the people with restricted growth around this room and he could say, well, you've got Russell Silver and you've got X. There are 200 causes of restricted growth. You thought we were all the same. Wrong. We're just short, but our actual impairments are different. And they have different consequences. So he can do that. So he did the biological aspect, and I did the sociological aspect, but we did the same thing. We used quantitative methods and qualitative methods. We did a survey. That's fine. Sometimes in disability studies, surveys have a dirty word. Quantitative methods. Why? Why? They're just another way of asking and finding out. We should be open to that, to all of these approaches. And I think we are, but we have an emphasis on the qualitative or the whatever. So going back to my my simple thing, we tried to explore most of that. So we wanted to know about their health. We wanted to know when they started having pain, what sort of pain they had. We wanted to know about their mental health. We found that they had much worse mental health. Disabled people generally have worse mental health. We wanted to know about education, employment, and all the rest of it. And the point is that the experiences of restricted growth people are not the same as those with other mobility impairments. Because in Britain we know that on average people with mobility impairments are twice as likely to be, people with disabilities are twice as likely to be unemployed as everybody else. You know that, yeah? Not true with people with restricted growth. We get jobs. We're not quite as much as everybody else, but we do get jobs. The trouble is they're rubbish jobs. We get jobs in the bottom tier. We're the receptionist, the back office person, the clerk. We have an office job. We don't get promoted. So it's like women. So we get a job, but it's a fully paid back office job. And that is true. There's discrimination. People think that they don't want to promote a restricted growth person or whatever else it might be. But that's not the whole story either. Because when we went to interview people, this is what we found. For them, getting a job was the key part of independence. And when they got a job, and they knew they could do it, and everybody recognised they could do it, and they had friends, and they'd been accommodated, and all the rest of it, they stuck in it. They didn't want to risk trying something else and failing. They didn't want to risk another office where they might not be welcome. Yeah? So that's a complicated story, isn't it? They were not experiencing direct discrimination, but they were themselves sort of self-censoring themselves. And guess what? Women, I think, do this too. And people with other impairments. So that's not just because they're not ambitious, it's because the culture, the workplace, the messages are all about, it's going to be difficult, so make the most of what you got. Don't try pushing forward. So I want us to not always think about victimhood or whatever. I want us to think about the complex. So if we want to change that, we've got to do various things, don't we? We need to empower individuals. We need to send explicit messages that we expect and hope for them to be promoted. We may have to have some sort of shadowing scheme so they see other workplaces or other work offices. We need to challenge bullying and harassment in the workplace, which disabled people experience, women experience, other minorities experience. It's a complex story. We need different interventions to solve that problem. We can't just assume it's straightforward employers that need to change. It's actually the whole environment. So, we wrote various papers. We tried to look at, and one of the things I said yesterday, I think, which was very interesting from this study, was that people with restricted growth didn't think of themselves as disabled. Through childhood, through young adulthood, no, I'm different, not disabled. But then as they got impairments and they faced discrimination, then they started saying, I feel disabled now. So I find that very interesting. And it's partly because disability is such a stigmatized identity. If you have a choice, you don't identify as disabled. That's a rule of thumb. If you can get away with it, you don't. Unless you're part of a group like this or a network like this where there's actually a value in it, it means that if you're not part of that, then you fear that you are going to be stigmatized and singled out and excluded. And that's a finding. That's a really important finding. Because after all, the UK had this Disability Discrimination Act, and it had a Disability Rights Commission. And they did some research. And they found that half of the people who had rights under the Disability Discrimination Act did not identify as disabled. So if you go out there saying, we're for disabled people, and half of the people you are meant to be serving don't go, yeah, that's me, how do you support them? They won't come forward, they won't identify. They think the cost of coming forward is greater than the benefit you'll give. Well, they think it's just not for them. So we have to be careful assuming identities. So they shifted to saying that they supported people who had rights under the Disability Discrimination Act. Do you see what I mean? You didn't have to say you were disabled in order to get that support. So I wanted to ask, what are we doing when we do disability studies? And I think I've probably said most of this. So what I mean is that we've got lots and lots of different things. One is about disabled people, broadly speaking, remembering that breadth of thinking about who is disabled or not. The other is about disabling society. I kind of think, I don't know, there's probably other things I haven't thought about. I'm sure they are. But those are the sort of two things you've got, the two broad families of work. You find out stuff about disabled people's lives, and remembering that we're the best experts on that, so there's a real emphasis on doing that in partnership or hearing voices or whatever there. Or you look at the barriers that exclude people, and you look at the way that environments and cultures and expectations and all the rest of it make life hard for us. Or not hard, might make us great, make it easy, because it's not always terrible. So there's a whole lot of stuff there. And a lot of stuff we haven't done. And I think we should get the lot of it. I remember we did this project in 1996, which led to the book, The Sexual Politics of Disability. And one of the reactions to that from a few individuals was, why are you talking about sex? Why are you talking about private stuff? Why are you talking about that? You should be talking about barriers. No, we should be talking about both. But actually, the personal is political. And it was so empowering for many, many disabled people that we were talking about sex. That we were saying disabled people can have sex. And we had stories of people who, guess what, had sex. That's really, people see themselves in that. And that's empowering. It's not going to get a new law, although it might help. It's not going to, remove physical barriers. But it does say to everybody, you should be talking about sex education, you should be aware of violence and abuse in the lives of disabled people, you should look at menstrual management or whatever it might be, you should look at all of these things. The same things that women and men without disabilities experience, we experience. So there are different ways to go forward. And we kind of need it all. If it's bad research, whoever did it, whatever it's, let's call it out. Let's say, well, that's a bit sloppy. And I put my hand up, some of my research is sloppy. Tell me about it. Let's do it better. Let's make fewer mistakes. I wouldn't have done it now the way I did it then. We learn. We're always learning. And I think I'm an academic. My duty is to the truth, however painful that is. And I'm not saying that there is one truth and we, like Moses on the mountain coming down with the tablets. I don't think that's how truth is. We can't ever have the tablets, but we can come closer to it. And some things are closer to it than other things. It's not just like, well, anything goes. So we try to come as close as we can, but we never quite get there. And that's fine. And if somebody else says, actually, that doesn't apply for my people, that's fine. Let's find out why. Let's look at the differences. So I do want us all to be committed to getting it more and more accurate. And I think we need that for the politics. Good disability research will get better disability politics. It'll identify the issues we need to address. It will find out things we didn't expect. Remember what I said about swimming. We didn't expect that. There's lots of things we don't expect. Paradoxes we don't see. So, you can find this online, but I think this is quite useful from the Society for Disability Studies. But it's broad. It's not a deficit approach, but it's multidisciplinary. Get disabled people at the leading role. So, you can find that online at the Society for Disability Studies. It's about teaching. So, different questions. And I think that it's not about making all disabled activists into researchers. Sure, we need a route into the academy. Yes, we do. But there's a division of labour. What is the solution for my wheelchair? And the fact that it needs pumped. I don't want you all to become wheelchair mechanics, but I want there to have access to a wheelchair mechanic. Yeah. I think that research is a technical, difficult thing. We do 3-year PhDs. Everybody can do it, but not everybody should have to do it. I think it's useful that we have specialists, as long as they listen to everybody else. If the wheelchair mechanic ignores me, puts a different tyre on, puts it up to what they think is appropriate, doesn't talk to me, that's rubbish. But I don't need to become a wheelchair mechanic. And the activist does not need to become a statistician. We just need to have a statistician on hand for when we want one. We need to make sure we have access to them. So I think a division of labour is really important, every dimension of disability. Multidisciplinary, I was very happy to hear you talk about multidisciplinarity. I don't know who, let me ask some, wake you up a bit. So, have we got sociologists in the room?
Yes.
Put your hand up. Put them down. Have we got psychologists in the room? Yeah, good. Have we got architects in the room? That's a shame. Have we got a clinician in the room? Yay, 2. Have we got a historian in the room? Yay, anthropologist. Yay, economist. Economist?
No, we don't have any.
Where the hell are the economists? So no economists. Social workers. Great. Rehabilitation, OT or PT? Yes.
Education.
Teachers? Yes. Political scientists? No. Designers?
There's some people I need to go outside and get, I think.
But you see my point. We need every one of you. Mathematicians?
Theologians.
Theologians, good.
Biologists.
Yeah, good. Well,
Yeah,
philosophers, yeah.
theologians.
And we need the whole caboodle. You get my point. I've not thought of everybody. But you need the whole geographers, you need the whole caboodle. We're multidisciplinary. Because they have specialist expertise, which we will need. I have loved working with psychologists. I've loved working with philosophers. I've loved working with economists. They're really brainy people. And if I spent all my time with sociologists, I'd end up in a sort of self-serving ghetto. They're lovely people too, but they can't tell me everything. So we need that diversity. And we need to go for different categories. Sometimes we're doing a study, all people who use wheelchairs. Sometimes we're doing a study of everybody with restricted growth. Sometimes we're doing a study of everybody with achondroplasia. That's my form of restricted growth. Sometimes it's all disabled people with disabilities or disabled people. And that's fine. Nothing wrong with any of that. And you know what? Sometimes we count people. I remember when I first started in disability research, the word got out that some people were counting people. Oh, you can't count people. Why the hell not? Sometimes you need statistics. There's this great Israeli statistics booklet. Fantastic. They've gone out and counted people. Excellent. Save me the bother. You know, use it. Use that data. What is the role of the disability academic? Well, there's some academic ideas about what different academics does. I love the Michel Foucault. I don't really know what it means. Zygmunt Bauman. I used to share Zygmunt Bauman's office in Leeds. I never met him, never knew he was there except for the elusive smell of pipe tobacco. He used to come in late at night and early in the morning and I never saw him. But there's this idea that this is such a privilege. Such a privilege. And Gramsci, all people are intellectuals, not all have the social function of intellectuals. I think that's really interesting. But we have the privilege, we have the luck to be academics. That is our job, and so we must make the most of it. And it's a responsibility. We're paid to do this great thing, And so we need to collaborate and be at the service of the people, and sometimes challenge them, sometimes hear them, always challenge them, and together we move the world. And so what are the risks? I was asked about risks. Well, I've said one of them, that we become a bit too disengaged. We become a bit too academic. You know, look at your last paper. Can a layperson understand it? If not, were there sort of key points at the top of it to enable lay people to understand it? Or did you go on the radio and talk about it? Or did you go to a school and explain it? I do think that when we write papers that nobody can understand, we may have gone the wrong way. Yeah? Because Einstein, who taught at this university, said make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I think that is my motto. I try for that. Make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. The world is complicated, but we must become as clear as we can. But the other way, we could come too applied. We could just go, oh, it's obvious, we'll just go and talk to people, or we'll just count people. That's the solution. Well, no, because we have to theorize it. We have to understand what's going on. We have to analyze it. We did a follow-up study to the sexuality study. And it was very interesting because we found that this is 20 years on with some of the same people. And we found that disability became a lot less salient as you got older. And the reason was that everybody was disabled. You know, people were all cranky and forgetting things, and their knees had gone, and these were people in their 50s and 60s. And suddenly, and also, older people, they're not looking for the trophy wife. The men are not looking at the trophy wife. They just want somebody to talk to. And so the disabled people had a much better time in their 50s than they were in their 30s. They were less anxious. And I thought, yeah, we can theorize that. We can talk about aging. We can talk about the life course. We can engage with sexuality and sexual reproductive health and all the rest of it. So we have to have theory. We can't just be simplistic. We're not just descriptive. We're trying to understand how it works. And I found recently the contribution of realist approaches, which were developed by people like Ray Pawson, in fact, at Leeds. Yeah. Really interesting, because they talk about context, mechanism, outcomes, CMO configurations. And what they're trying to do is to work out why things happen as they do. Make predictions. Have a theory, test the theory. If it doesn't work, refine a theory. And then you can say what's going on. What a wonderful thing that is if it could work. That we're not just descriptive. And so we have a theory about how disability is in Israel. We design a little study to test that. We find our theory is wrong. We refine that. Maybe then we go and do a big survey and see if everybody agrees with that. But you know, we're not just here to look. We're here to contribute. There's an issue about either excluding people, that we just don't think that they should be around our table. We don't think we should ask them what's important. We don't think that we need to share with them our findings. We don't think that we might be barking up the wrong tree. So there's a risk of excluding. And there's a risk of tokenism. You know, we just have one in the room. Oh look, they're our expert. We're okay. We did it. Tick the box. Tell the funder, yes, we did it. Didn't listen to them. They felt bemused by what we were talking about. Or maybe not. They felt very proud to be there. We paid them a day rate. But they're not really making a difference. We've got to be honest about when they're making a difference. And also which questions we're willing to change and which we're not. One was, we had a very interesting time on that restricted growth study because it was managed by the Restricted Growth Association, who were a disabled people's organisation. And that was useful, that was difficult, they were very suspicious of research, they didn't want me asking anybody any questions, so we had to make absolutely clear, because I'm one of them, and they didn't want to tell their private stories to me. So we had to have very clear anonymity, and the researcher will anonymise the transcripts. No, Tom won't read any of them, he won't be able to, well, I read them, but not identify them. And I remember we had money at the end of the project, and we wanted to go and present our findings at a conference. And of course, you know, when you've got a research funding, if you don't spend the money, it goes back to the funder. So this money was not for the DPO, it was just for the project. And we said, well, why don't we send our researcher to a conference? And their reaction is, no, that's a freebie. You're not spending our money on a freebie. And it was like, no, conferences aren't just freebies. They're about sharing our findings. They're about promoting you and your work. And we could go together with you and all the rest of it. But no, not spending money on a freebie. They were wrong. They were silly. They were short-sighted. But, you know, where is that coming from? It was probably coming from the fact that they've been treated badly for years and years and weren't feeling very positive about the world. I don't know. But I was very cross about that because we gave this money back. We couldn't spend it because they wouldn't let us. But their point was they wouldn't let us. It was their funding. They controlled it. So it's right that they had that voice, even if we suffered as a result. And I said in my talk the danger of becoming too political, losing the critical edge, losing independence. Sometimes we need to say to the disabled people's movement, the evidence says that you're not representing what people really want. The evidence says that you should think more about that, or that this doesn't always work. So, for example, some people in the disability rights movement have said that personal assistance, independent living, is about taking the emotion out of social care. It becomes a contractual relationship. I pay you, you do something for me, I don't have to feel gratitude, we get rid of all the emotions. That's what some people say in independent living and social care. It's not true. It's not true. When you go and research with people, it's a relationship. You're a support worker working with the same person for months, maybe years, maybe decades. That's not a relationship? Of course it's a relationship. It might not. I don't feel like I'm going to marry our taxi driver, nice though he was, because we saw him once, we'll never see him again. That's just a contractual exchange. But when you're working with somebody all the time, or for any length of time, you know, it's a relationship. We know each other. We have an obligation. We're going to do our best for each other. We might feel resentful of each other. We might go, well, why can't I do that? And why are you always late? And whatever it might be. No, you do laugh, but everybody is, we all have these issues. So in our study we found that personal assistance relationships still involved emotions. It's not an earth-shattering conclusion, but it's important. And we need to, and managing emotions, managing relationships is difficult, and we need to support people to do that better. That's what we found. And so that was a challenge to the Disabled People's Network. But we told them that, and they listened, and they said, thank you very much. And then actually they reflected and said, yeah, we did know that, we just didn't say that. And that's the thing, what you know and what you feel able to say is sometimes different. So that's me. I've been a little bit under my time, but hopefully that leaves a few more minutes for talking. And thank you for listening. And this is my view. I have some evidence, but you are very free to disagree. So we have microphones there.
Right, thank you, Tom. So we do have some time for questions. I remind you that I'm going to be... You only speak when you have this in your hand.
Say who you are, please.
I'm from the autistic community of Israel. In your talk, you mentioned in relating to working with people with disabilities, you always said organizations with people with disabilities, and you also mentioned tokenism. Could you explain a little about the difference? Because we experience this a lot. Researchers or people who plan conferences often approach our activities as individuals and very rarely relate to their affiliation to an organization. What is the difference? What is does it make a difference?
So the question is about whether we approach people as individuals or as organizations. Does it make a difference? Yeah, I do think it makes a difference. I don't think all organizations are representative. Ideally, you'd have representative organizations who summed up the views of the wider population. I don't think that's the case. I think that it is good, it is important, it is a priority to involve organizations, and that's how the whole process around the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities goes. That's how we did it with the World Report on Disability. We tried to be very connected to the International Disability Alliance, and the International Disability Alliance is the network of representative organizations. But I'm not sure that representative organizations are the final word. So I'd say to you, yes, the priority is to involve representative organizations, But no, don't think by doing that that you've necessarily reached the wider community. For example, back to that project we did, People with Restricted Growth. We don't know whether members of the Restricted Growth Association are typical of everybody else. We could have just researched with them, but we made every effort to get people who are not in the organisation. And in the end, I think about half of our respondents were in the organisation and half were not. And I think that's really important, because sometimes the people in the organisation are the most excluded and they need it most. Sometimes they're the most privileged and they are actually doing quite well. Sometimes they're a mixture, we hope they're a mixture, but we don't know until we've seen the wider population. So yeah, I don't think we should just take individuals as the spokespeople for a whole community, but I also think we need to be critical friends of organisations who might not always represent everybody affected by it. For example, I do quite a lot of work in the space of Down syndrome, and organisations are very, very positive about Down syndrome. And rightly so, because the evidence is there. But there are people who are not in organisations, who have a different experience. The evidence says 2/3 of people with children with Down syndrome do well, and 1/3 of people do less well. We don't hear from the people who do less well. They're not clamouring. It's difficult for them to say what they want to say. So as researchers, we need to talk to both. We need to talk to the organisation, but we need to make sure that we don't neglect those other voices. So I hope that helps.
I thought you were going to ask me. חשבתי שאת רוצה לשאול.
My name is Amit, please. I want to ask, when I study, the aim of the basic research is not to make the world better, is to get more knowledge and data. So, in the disabled or strange or whatever, people that are not totally physically normal, it's to me is that the first place is not to get to make them better, is first of all to get the knowledge and the data that helps them, if you know what I mean. The first place is to get the basic science, then to move to the more applied science.
Yes, I think that's right, in the sense that research, you need to find out the whole picture. That's absolutely true, and you don't make any assumptions before you start. But why are we bothering with disability? Why don't we do something else? We're doing disability for a reason, I think. We have a commitment as individuals, I think. There are many questions we could ask about disability. I mean, and we need to look at the balance of the questions that are being asked. I do think we need everybody around this room, but I would give more money to the people who are doing research that's going to make a difference to people's lives. I'm not ashamed of that. I do think impact. In Britain, we talk about impact. I think that's really important. I'm not saying you shouldn't get any money if you're, counting how many angels balance on the head of a pin. We should give you a little bit of money, but I want much more money for people who are trying to work out how to solve the problem of pain, or people who are trying to challenge employment barriers, whatever. So we need everything, but I would prioritise some things.
Just to see who has other questions. Sharon, Engarad, and Shira. So we'll get 3 more questions, Sharon, Engarad, and Shira. And they try to be focused so that we can have the time to answer all 3 of them. So you pick some.
There you go. Okay. So I'm Angharad Beckett, and I'm the co-director of the Centre for Disability Studies at the University of Leeds. Tom has mentioned some of the work that's been conducted there over the years. So I had a couple of observations, and then I had 2 questions, and I suspect may I ask you to choose which one you would like to focus on? So my 3 very quick points were just to add to, I thought that Tom summarised things beautifully, and the thinking I've had about where we're at in disability studies very, very well. Other things I think, and maybe you would comment on, I think that we need to look at confusion between models and theories in our field as well, and use them appropriately. You know, models, they're very useful tools for analysis, but we do need the theoretical angles for explaining things. I think there's confusion there. I think we need to look more at understanding impairment and the way that impairment is actually produced, constructed, created within society as well. We need to make sure we do enough of that. And then Tom talked about emancipatory research, and I see it as a moral horizon, something we strive for. But just something that struck me as you were speaking, Tom, is that you know, we often in disability studies, there'll be an article that introduces an idea, and it will set forth some criteria. So emancipatory research is 1, 2, 3, social model, run by disabled people, achieving change. Okay, I mean, these are not bad things. But then we sometimes leave it there and think that we either have to judge ourselves against whether we meet those criteria, and if we don't, we say, oh, we didn't achieve emancipatory research, and we beat ourselves up about it, perhaps. But sometimes I encourage my students to also get back into the debate about what emancipatory research or any other of these concepts that we have could mean as well. They don't have to be static. So I think that's an important thing for disability studies. Now my questions were, how as non-disabled researchers, those of us who don't identify as disabled people, how do we get it right and where do we go wrong, Tom, sometimes? And how do we balance this thorny issue of credibility in an academic world that sets all these expectations that sometimes it's almost as if we have to be obscure to gain academic credibility. Do you see what I'm saying? People say, oh, that's a very clever piece of writing by this person, and yet it isn't as accessible and potentially useful as we might want. So there's loads of things there, but I wondered if you choose any of those and comment, maybe?
Tom, is it okay if we collect the 2 other questions?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. We'll collect the 2 other questions, and Tom will answer all of them, or part of them.
My name is Shira. I'm an occupational therapist and a service accessibility expert. My main research is on cognitive accessibility. I'm also the head of the Israeli
זה לא...
הבנתי, אז שזה...
אוקיי, אז אני פשוט לדבר בכל יותר. I'm sure my main research area is on cognitive accessibility. I'm also the head of the Israeli Institute of Cognitive Accessibility. You kind of defined yourself earlier as a critical realist researcher, and part of the issues that I'm kind of dealing with or find myself in a bind sometimes is actually on the other end of the question that we had before. My studies are usually very much applied, and I often know, because of my applied work, I sort of know what might and might not be possible, and on the other end, you have the granting bodies that often look for the more maybe critical thinking. And I often am at an on which part do I go with, especially when I'm working with people with cognitive disabilities, and I always do my studies with people. And then how do I deal with the granting organization?
שרון, and then we'll get all of them.
Hold the both from the society has. I'm from the minority, professional minority, that was mentioned before. Corrective justice. And I work in the school, human rights organization, and I'm doing a PhD here in law school about involuntary commitment. You mentioned that you do not shy from medical research, that you utilize it. And in a sense, you play along in the medical model and you're brutal about it. Now, I think it's easier when you deal with physical disabilities, especially genetic-based. When you come to psychiatric disability, when I say that, I should say psychosocial, and that is in essence the problem. Because on the one hand, there's a whole richness of research from the medical world, which would be very beneficial for me. There's very little work from a legal perspective and even far little from a disability perspective. They have loads of ethical literature and medical literature. But if I use this research, then I'm now mixing methodology with ideology. Because for some people, accepting the medical model in psychosocial disability is heritage. So that, as a researcher, I'm bringing an opinion into the research, which is aside from the research. I take a stand in that, and it's a whole different question, which is not part of the research. And I think it's much more challenging when you have research in these areas rather than
So now you have the challenge of trying to answer whatever you have time to answer in 4 minutes.
Right, thank you. Well, we can take one off straight away. Yes, non-disabled people are welcome. They have a role. They should work wherever possible in partnership with disabled people. But I mean, yeah, if you're looking at, I don't know, if you're an architect and you're looking at barriers, then, you know, check with disabled people what the barriers are that make them problematic. But if you're doing stuff about engineering and steel and ramp, yeah, just do it. You know, you don't do it without consulting us, because you might think that a ramp like that is okay, whereas actually it's probably 1 in 12. But you don't have to have us there all the time. Do you know what I mean? We don't mean to be on site. You know, consult and then get on with it. So I think that there are different relations and different engagements, but I welcome non-disabled expertise. I think, you know, we have to have it, but we need also to have disabled researchers. So, you know, we've got to all of us, disabled and non-disabled, work to get more disabled people doing the stuff that we do. In terms of cognitive accessibility, I think I know what you're getting at, but you know, I don't think we can bring everything down to the level of somebody with a profound, well, I know we can't, intellectual disability. But you know, I think we have a duty to try and use plain language, to try and disseminate our findings. We did an easy read version of the World Report on Disability, for example. So I think things like that are really important. But I don't think that we can do things at that level because, you know, disability is complex. And sometimes people won't understand it, but that doesn't mean it's not right what we're doing. But we have to be very careful when we do that, because we don't want to lose contact with our community, and we want to try and put it into accessible language, and there's lots of examples of people doing that. I think this question of mental health, you're right, it is complicated. I don't use the term psychosocial disability. I do talk about recovery. I do work with psychiatrists. I do consider that mental health is real. I think that we have evidence-based approaches. I think we can challenge people's assumptions, we can challenge people's language, we can challenge people's approaches. But you know, I think that, for example, genetics is really important for some mental health conditions, not all. So we need to try and have that discussion. I've done a lot of work on the ICD-11, for example, and what have we done on the ICD-11? We've gone to ask people with those conditions whether the new diagnostic guidelines represents them. So we've asked people with lived experience, with schizophrenia, with bipolar, with unipolar, with generalized anxiety disorder, and with personality disorder. We've asked them, okay, here are the diagnostic guidelines, how do they fit with your experience? So I think that's user involvement. I think it's holding people to account. I think it's saying, you know, let's see what voices are not in the debate. But we've got to have that user involvement. But I don't want to let go of the value of psychiatry or whatever else it might be. So I agree with you, it's very, very difficult, and I'm sure I get it wrong quite a lot of the time. But equally, you know, when people from the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry tell me, you know, we're just the same as everybody else and there's never a need for, you know, whatever it might be, I go, well, I'm not sure, I don't think that is what actually the wider population are experiencing. We could go out and talk more widely, not just to the activists, but also to people with lived experience, and often we get a more nuanced view. So, you know, and it's a difficult one. It's a really, really difficult one, and you're right, it feels more complicated, more difficult than a lot of the stuff with physical impairment. But, you know, we need to go there, and we need to listen, and we will get it wrong, and we'll try and do it better, and we try to get over that terrible toxic gulf between professionals and people. But yeah, it's hard, and I'm willing to carry on talking and listening and try to get it better. So, try to.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to be starting back.
מה זה סייף דארלי? מה זה שלום? מה זה סייף דארלי?
Okay, so I do want to say that I'm going to be making one slight change, and I hope it won't affect many of us, but what I'm going to be doing, because I do feel that we want a bit more time for questions, and also because when I let you go outside of the room that you don't come back in time. So we were supposed to have a break between Hannah and Nira, but I think we will delete this break so that we have a few more minutes for a question. After that you get a bigger break and we'll have lunch, etc. If any of you do feel that you need a break in between, you can just feel free to go out, come back in, and so we'll do this way. So our next speaker, Dr. Hannah Morgan. Hannah is a senior lecturer in disability studies in the Department of Sociology and director of the Center for Disability Research at Lancaster University. Her research is concerned with disabled people's experiences of health and welfare services and of professional education and practice in these areas. She has recently completed research on tackling violence against disabled women and girls, on developing new forms of social work practice with people with learning disabilities, and on men with learning disabilities' experience of self-harm and locked words. Hannah is currently working on a book that explores the relationship between disabled people, disability studies, and social work. And lastly, she is the executive editor and book reviews editor of Disability and Society, and a member of the editorial board of Social Work Education. So Hannah, we're very, very happy to have you here. And Hannah is going to be talking about tackling violence against disabled women and girls, experience and learning from a user-led study.
Thank you. It's always lovely to be introduced like that. You sound much more impressive than you ever think you are. It's like imposter syndrome, it stalks you. Best at work. Is it all right? Yeah, good enough. Tell me if it moves. I was asked to choose a piece of my recent research to talk about, and it felt important that tackling violence against disabled women and girls was the one I focused upon for a number of reasons. Firstly, because I think it's a very important piece of research and that many of our findings will travel and be relevant to your context, but also I think importantly because it was a piece of user research, and so I wanted to reflect a little bit on the experiences of, the opportunities and the challenges of doing user research in such an important area. So I want to talk a little bit about user-led research and co-produced research, which is how we describe this project. I want to talk very briefly about disability research on independent living and learning, which is DRILL for short, which is the research funding programme that supported our research.
and then to focus for most of the time on the findings of the research. I've got a lot of slides and there's quite a lot of text on them, but the idea was that they'd be quite freestanding, so I will be covering a lot of what's in the slides and moving through them quite quickly. No, not at all. Better? Okay. Tom, I think, has covered a lot of this ground already, so I'm only going to talk about it very briefly. But I suppose I would locate my work in this tradition of the critique of traditional forms of research on disability, and Tom did cover a lot of what I was going to say, so I'll move beyond that. I suppose the comment that I would make, in addition to what's already been said, is the role of emancipatory research. I'm going to talk in a second about 2 research projects, one of which I had the privilege of working on, that certainly did describe themselves in those terms. And I think my reflection on doing a variety of disability research projects over 15, 20 years now as an academic is that, as Anne Harrod said, this is a moral horizon. It's very difficult for any piece of research to be truly emancipatory in terms of the principles that are outlined in articles by work by people like Stone and Priestley. And I think it's important they aren't a static list of things that we fail to meet up to all the time, because that's a difficult position to put yourselves in. But I do think they become a checklist of questions and opportunities for reflection. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if a piece of research isn't controlled by a user-led organisation. It isn't necessarily a bad thing if you use a particular type of method or not, but that we should be reflexive and think about and be transparent about the decisions that we've made and acknowledge perhaps where things have worked better or not. So the 2 examples I'm just going to highlight.
Anna, will it be helpful for you if I take? You can tell me when to change the slide.
Do you mind? Sorry, I'm having to look sideways and press a button, which is beyond me this morning. On many mornings. So my first research job, I did the MA in Disability Studies at Leeds. I was tutored by Colin Barnes. I'm in that mould, although I think I've developed a bit since then. Was to work on a project called Creating Independent Futures, and it was an immense privilege to work on as a first job. It was funded by the National Lottery. It was a user-led project in that the National Centre for Independent Living held the grants, and then Leeds University did the work. And it was really exciting to do a project that was initiated by disabled people, that was accountable, that was working with disability organisations all the way through. And that's really where I cut my teeth as a researcher. So my starting point was as a user-led researcher. And so I often kind of struggled with going to, and I remember my first ever conference presentation where I presented about this research, and being really surprised about how threatened lots of mainstream researchers were. That's quite enough user-led research, they said. And if I looked around the room, they didn't literally say that. But if you added up the amount of money and the amount of researchers that we represented, the 2 or 3 of us there on user-led projects, compared to the rest of the funding in the room, we were such a tiny, tiny little part of that, and yet we seemed very threatening. So I think there's a real issue there about power imbalance and about remembering to say that this remains a very small part of a very large field. There is still a very small amount of user-led research or user-controlled research, and that it's easy to think, particularly when you work in this field, that there's more than there is, and that we've kind of pushed the boundaries perhaps slightly further than we actually have. The other piece of research I'm highlighting here is called Supporting People, that was produced by a consortium, I suppose, of people aligned to a user-led organisation that looked at person-centred support. And again, that tried to set itself out adhering to principles of user involvement, user accountability, but also very useful research. And I think what was interesting about both pieces is they worked very hard to be open and transparent about what they were doing, but also to reach a range of people and audiences. So they certainly produced highly regarded academic papers, but then produced, for example, the book supporting people in the equivalent book for the other project are very accessible. They could easily be read by people working in user-led organisations and useful to them. So I suppose one of the questions is around breaking out of that niche of just purely seeing user-led research as a very particular piece. I think there are some questions around appropriation of disabled people's research and where the power lies in making sure that user-led research doesn't become a cover for other sorts of research. And I think there's a question that Tom highlighted and that's come out in the discussions about, does research have to be user-led to be emancipatory, and is all user-led research emancipatory? And I think there's a lot of nuance and debate within that. So very recently, and it's been very heartening, that again the National Lottery in the UK has funded a specific stream of work, DRILL, Disability Research in Independent Living and Learning. Tom's involved, so he can probably answer more detailed questions about the programme itself. But what was really exciting about this was it was a 5-year programme, it had £5 million. It was led by disabled people. So a consortium of disability organisations from each of our 4 home nations worked together. They had a panel that set priorities, a call for research funding. And their key goal was to enable disabled people to achieve independent living and fulfil potential. And they argued that one of the key ways of doing that was about the availability of robust research. So Tom mentioned often we do research on things we already know, and in lots of ways the Tackling Violence project confirmed what we knew. We didn't find much that was very new or unexpected, but what was really important was to provide a robust, defendable research evidence to support what people were telling us more anecdotally. And that was the really exciting thing about the DRILL projects, was they funded some quite small pieces of research. So our piece of research was about £40,000 over 18 months, which sounds like a lot of money until you actually spread it over 18 months, and it really is a tiny amount of money. But there aren't very many places you can get that sort of small project from in the UK. Our research councils want you to bid for £500,000, and that's not always a viable project. What was also really helpful about DRILL was that they were willing to have these small pilot projects rather than it having to be a well-developed kind of further on project. I think the idea was that some of those pilots might be built on in terms of further research. But it was an opportunity to test out some sort of innovation activity and to research it at the same time, and to do that reasonably quickly. So again, just a little bit more about DRILL. It was very clear that DRILL wasn't about doing research on or for disabled people. It absolutely at its heart had to be in partnership. Now Tom may have a reflection on some of the reality of that in practice, because I suspect there were established researchers, academics who went and looked for disabled people's organisations to work with, and there are some tensions there about how that practice works. I was very lucky to have an established relationship with a number of user-led organisations, but with one where this was an opportunity where we could come together rather than we either had to look for a project. And the principles that underpinned this programme were that the research had to be accessible in ways that were accessible and understandable to everyone, and that, very importantly, the research findings were made available in a range of formats. So often, if we're funded by traditional research councils, they're getting better at funding us to write accessible formats to speak at a range of different events. But because it was a requirement of this research project, it was easier for us to fund it and to include it. A focus on the lived experience of individuals and to see that as an expertise in itself. That our goals should be collaborative and shared as researchers. And I think really importantly, and one that we grapple with, I'm not claiming any moral high ground here, I think it's a grappling and a testing when you work in co-production, is to try and equalise power relationships, to try and ensure that we genuinely worked together. And I think the idea of it being co-produced was really important. So the title talks about working in co-production with service providers, but actually I think more important to the project was that it was a co-production between 3 organisations. A question might be, could a user-led organisation have done this piece of research on their own? Very possibly. Both partners that we worked with had highly skilled academics employed directly by them. But there were things that we brought as academics, particularly employed by a university. It was much, much easier for us to do a literature review because we have access to the materials freely. We have a research infrastructure, we have a practical infrastructure that we could bring an expertise. For example, we have a research ethics committee that we could take the project to and get approval that would be very difficult for a small user-led organisation. Although there were tensions there between I suppose the enthusiasm and momentum of a user-led organisation and the slightly slower deliberations of a university process. And I think at times the user-led organisation were frustrated by the questions that we got from the ethics committee. Not unreasonable questions. Our ethics committee has been very responsive to changing how it thinks about disabled people's research. But I think those are some of the tensions that we kind of have to grapple with when we work in co-production. So it was a partnership between 3 organisations. It was led both in terms of them initiating the research but also holding the grants by Vision Sense, which is a user-led organisation and a social enterprise based in the northeast of England, near Newcastle. And they do a range of research, largely around issues of violence and abuse, but not only. We also partnered with Against Violence and Abuse, AVA, which is a third sector charity that works across the UK focusing on gender-based violence, and us as a research centre. I think I mentioned already, but what was really important was we had an established relationship with Vision Sense. Their research director had done her PhD in our department. We'd worked collaboratively together. I'd worked on previous projects for them, which highlights some of the challenges. One small project, I ended up contributing my time freely because it was simply too much hassle to set up the university processes for the small amount of money they were able to pay for 2 days of my time, so we just bypassed that. But it meant we had quite a reciprocal relationship where I was able to give my time and expertise and didn't need to charge for it. We could do that where we could work together on a project. We made sure that we did that in a more equitable way. So it was initiated by Vision Sense, but we developed the ideas and the project itself very clearly in co-production. And there was a real respect of our relative expertise and priorities and what we brought to the project. You may well be familiar with a lot of this evidence, but what we know is there is now a very strong evidence base that's been captured at both an international and national level that disabled people experience higher levels of violence and abuse than the general population, and that disabled women and girls experience a higher level of abuse compared to disabled men, but also compared to their non-disabled peers. This is the definition of gender-based violence produced by the UN in 1993. They describe gender-based violence as being any act that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual or mental harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. That was the first official definition of gender-based violence and has been really helpful for us in terms of tailoring the research. We were really pleased at how broadly it enabled us to focus, and certainly when we talked about violence and abuse, we very clearly wanted to privilege violence at the beginning of that list, but that it included abuse, that it included neglect, and perhaps some of the areas of abuse that particularly in the lives of disabled people and disabled women haven't been conceptualised in that way in the past. And what we were very clear about in terms of the drill priorities about independent living is that disabled women, nobody can experience independent living without safety, without feeling safe and knowing that they're safe, and without freedom from violence. And that we particularly wanted to understand more about the gendered nature of the violence that disabled women were experiencing, and therefore that services could respond to that appropriately. So the real momentum for the research came from a disabled women's survivor group that Vision Sense has supported over a number of years and that has supported research before. We knew that there is already a body of evidence that tells us that disabled women experience violence and abuse and what that tends to be. We also know there's quite a lot of research, less compared to other groups, but certainly a reasonable amount of research about disabled women's experiences of crisis or of immediate service responses to violence and abuse, so about refuges, about very immediate responses. But what disabled women from the survivor group said was, actually no one really focuses on longer term. No one focuses on 4, 5, 6 months down the line or years down the line potentially, and that's where services don't really respond or consider issues of violence. So there's a lack of evidence, but we're also fairly sure there is a lack of thought about this, a lack of services, and they really wanted us to test out and explore that, because their experiences were that the medium to longer term support was missing. Where it was in place, it was inadequate. Most service provision was inaccessible, and there were some very obvious gaps they felt, particularly around areas like housing. And one of the things they also told us that was really important, that they wanted us to test out and to evidence if we could, was the value that they placed to peer support. Of disabled women, of disabled survivors being able to spend time together and work together after violence, and about that being a really important part of survival and of about thriving after abuse. So these are our full research questions. I'll just highlight them very briefly. We wanted to know what disabled women and girls wanted from services, what helped them stay safe. We had a particular focus on safeguarding adults review, so that our policy has changed somewhat, but in general, local authorities, local areas are required where someone with care and support needs experiences abuse or significant harm, there has to be a review. And so we wanted to look at those reviews because in general, and I'll come back to this, it's been very hard to learn from them. They've tended to be hidden. There's very little joined up learning from these reports. And what we also know, and it's not just anecdotal, we see it in the media and so on, is that there is often a repetition of the type of violence and abuse that people experience year on year. Another example of each time. Why can't people learn from a different local area? Why can't local areas avoid the same things happen repetitively? We also wanted to understand how services could work more effectively for disabled women and girls, to understand what they were currently doing, how they felt they could improve, what they needed to improve, and how services could work together. Because disabled women were telling us it tended to be a mixture of services, but those services tended not to be joined up in any way. So we used mixed methods. The two highlighted in the different colours are the ones that we were responsible. So we did a systematic review of the literature, which was fairly small literature. There were interviews with disabled women who are survivors. There was a survey and interviews with service providers. And then we gathered these safeguarding adults reviews and analysed those. There were 4 streams to the research, and we divided them based on the expertise of the partners in terms of who looked at which bit, although we did that together. I'm going to go through the literature review quite quickly. It's available, so I can pass it on to anyone who wants it. We looked at a number of different databases with a range of terms to try and capture as much as we could. And from a very large pool, we actually came down to about 17 articles that genuinely looked at longer term interventions for disabled women. So it's a very small literature. It's English literature, so there may well be things that we didn't find. But there was very, very little research mentioning longer term supports, and particularly best practice that people could then use to affect change. The research highlights a range of broader considerations that are specific to disabled women, that they tend to be at an increased risk of isolation, that there's an increased dependency, whether that's physical or emotional or economic, as a result of a lack of services can make them more vulnerable to violence and certainly to escaping violence. That many service providers struggle to identify disability-related abuse, they don't see it in those terms, or that disabled people are experiencing traditional forms of research, so domestic violence might be seen as a safeguarding issue because the person is a carer rather than their partner. And that there are a whole range of barriers that were preventing disabled women from getting appropriate support. The research tells us quite a lot about why women don't approach services. Many of these are more generic to disabled people using services, but that there are particular challenges that often abusers exploit disability, knowing that often those women will find it harder to access support because they can be isolated, because the services that are available aren't accessible. We know that the marginalisation of disabled women often presents them as vulnerable, and that their impairment can be seen to make them vulnerable, and that makes them a greater target. But also makes them wary about attracting attention from services, because what the outcomes of that might be for them. And lots of women were really worried about what the implications might be. So they might be able to leave an abusive partner or an abusive caregiver, but often what they'd be offered was a residential home. So something that in some ways was just as violent and just as inappropriate, but that was the choice they were weighing up. So what's the point of accessing services if actually there isn't a real option for you? We found that disability and violence services tended to work in isolation. There was very little discussion or interaction between them. Domestic violence services didn't really think about disability. Disability services didn't really think about violence. Reporting seemed to be quite difficult, particularly when there are relationships within that, whether that's with a partner or a caregiver, if they're the person perpetrating the violence. As I've mentioned, people are very concerned about being rehoused or put into inappropriate care support. And there is a lack, although there's more research, there remains a considerable lack of accessible refuges. The BBC did a recent Freedom of Information request and found that the vast majority of refuges, which are already under substantial pressure in the UK as a result of austerity, very, very few of them are accessible to disabled women. I'm just going to skip ahead to the next one. Yeah. One of the things that we found from the literature and that was really important to us to highlight was the impact of institutional abuse, an area of abuse that's often not been seen as a form of violence or abuse. Particularly our policy documents in the last 5 or 10 years have got better at listing this and acknowledging this as a type of abuse, but often it remains slightly hidden. So for example, lots of the women we talked to, particularly women with learning difficulties or mental health experiences who perhaps have been in psychiatric systems, had very difficult experiences of restraint and forms of seclusion as methods of dealing with them. Restraint was an issue also for women with physical impairments, and that they may also have previous experiences of violence and abuse that colour their experiences of current services. And that in general these types of research don't take account of issues around gender, but particularly about the trauma that women live with longer term. Often it's written off, particularly in secure settings. Women have to demonstrate that they've moved beyond the violence or the trauma that they've experienced to show that they've recovered enough to leave that setting. So while most of us would acknowledge that experiences of trauma have a lifelong impact on individuals, we're kind of forcing women in services to say that they've got over those experiences as a way of demonstrating that they should be moving on, rather than recognising that actually it's reasonable and expected for those things to have a very long legacy for us. So the second part of the research was looking at these safeguarding adults reviews. I don't know if you have anything comparable. Since the 2014 new care home legislation, it's now a requirement that local authorities undertake these reviews. Before that, it was much more up to local authorities how they responded. And moving on to the next slide, there's no legal requirement to publish or to hold all of these in one place. So a charity in the UK, the NSPCC, holds all the children's equivalents of these. You can go online, you can search them, you can open them, you can do all sorts of analysis about trends, about what's happening, about localities. But when we started the research, there was nothing like that. There is now a small repository that's been funded by the Department of Health, but when it was launched in the summer, it had about 95 reports in it, and we know that there are nearer 200 a year published, so we know that there's a very small number that have been managed to be collated. So we were aware that this is probably quite a partial view. We identified all the reviews that we could find that involved disabled women from about 2003. But we got those through begging, through borrowing. Some are published online. Some people gave them to us on the basis that we could read them, but we couldn't formally name them in the research. So it was a very mixed picture. I've got 3 I'm just going to point to very briefly. I chose these 3 partly because they give quite different experiences, but also the 3 are available online, so people can learn from them. They can go and read the full report and understand the context. So the first one relates to a young woman called Melissa. It's not her real name. She was 18 and murdered by a young man of similar age when they were both living in a privately run care home for adults with autism in 2004. And the report came to the conclusion that her death was both probable, it was almost inevitable that it was going to happen in a set of circumstances that she and this young man were living, but also that it was entirely preventable. And this young man obviously now has this legacy to live with. So there are real issues here about the lack of adequate risk assessment. This was a young man who'd had a long history in his childhood about inappropriate sexual behaviour and violence, but there was a tendency to focus on the positive elements of his life and not record the risk that he posed to women. If you read the report, there is no way you would have put him in the same care home as a young woman. You could understand what sort of violence was going to happen. They were both young people who were placed a long way from their homes, geographically hundreds of miles away, because of a lack of services where they were at home, but also a lack of inadequate transition planning. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, young people turn 18 and adult services have to deal with them as if they've had no idea that they're coming, and no one's thought about what challenges that would bring. And it doesn't happen like that, but that's what you'd think from the way services respond. And inevitably, as a result of that, services aren't in place, and often people spend a long time away from their home. So they're away from their networks of people that love and care about them, who keep an eye out for them, who want to keep them safe. But also, particularly in Melissa's case, the local authority where she was placed at a private provider had no idea about her or about this young man, so there was no checks and safeguards. The second one I'm going to highlight briefly is a slightly older woman in her 50s called Amy who had learning disabilities in a range of conditions, and I've chosen this one because we've had a spate, certainly of cases that have been publicised, of people with learning disabilities dying preventable deaths from conditions that really ought to have been treated, often around managing bowels. It's not a great surprise that people know that people with learning difficulties are more susceptible to some of these conditions. And here the abuse probably wasn't neglectful. Lots of the care workers really did care and want to provide a good service for her, but they weren't adequately supported to manage her health needs and to manage her bowel health in a way that would have kept her safe. And a lot of this is happening with the best of intentions. So health providers wanting to respect confidentiality, but then not sharing information with care providers. And actually often it's the most lowly care providers in terms of the hierarchy who do the day-to-day work, and they simply didn't have the information about her health condition. There's also some substantial issues around our mental capacity legislation. So we have legislation that says we must presume capacity, and that where someone is deemed to lack capacity to make a particular decision, that a best interest decision should be made on their behalf. And there are different areas in which this is not working well. Sometimes professionals are going, well, we have to presume capacity, so we'll presume capacity almost despite any evidence to the contrary, which is not what the legislation says. It does say very clearly, if there is evidence someone lacks capacity, we should investigate that. But there is a tendency to say, they're adults, people have choice and control, they can make bad decisions, almost as if that's not our problem anymore. The other side of that is when people come in too early and make decisions on people's behalves. But here it was a very slow process for Amy, so there was a delay in her treatment. So I think the final point I've got on the slide is around recognising that the neglect isn't willful. This wasn't deliberate on the part of the support staff, of the health staff, but it was a range of predictable, I think, failings, particularly around communication. And then the final one is interesting because it involves three people, a family grouping, and often issues involve a number of people who might be vulnerable to and perpetrators of violence. These are rarely one-way relationships, and we have to be clear that we understand that people can be both victims and perpetrators at the same time. Angela was a woman in her late 40s who had diabetes and long-term mental health difficulties. Barry was her brother and Claire was her mother, and they had a very complex relationship of both providing care but also patterns potentially of what we might see as abuse. And this was somewhere where, again, there was a delay in addressing issues around mental capacity. So Angela had stopped taking her insulin, so she became at very high risk of harm very, very quickly. And despite a long history of mental health and of refusing treatment in the past, again, they kind of went through this route of, no, she's an adult, she has capacity, we should leave her, without a recognition of how timely and important it was to deal with this issue really quickly. She could have died within a matter of days. We didn't have 3 weeks for people to take their time and to think very gradually about this. So there were delays around the support around mental capacity. Housing was a really big issue here because she both needed to be in appropriate housing, but she wanted to be near her family members, and trying to move one disabled person geographically is difficult. If you're trying to move two people who perhaps have different support needs and accessible housing needs, to find something equivalent is almost impossible. It's about recognising these co-caring relationships, but also this was a family where there were lots of what we might call low-level safeguarding concerns, lots of little areas of concern, little issues that nobody pulled together to say, actually, if you put these together, they're quite substantial. So I think this kind of highlights some of the key themes that we found. So there was the impact of inadequate services was really significant for large numbers of people in creating vulnerability to forms of violence and abuse. I would argue that inadequate services are a form of abuse in themselves that we're not honest or accountable enough about. The role of the Mental Capacity Act, particularly a failure to address health needs as a form of violence and a form of abuse. Tom highlighted that particularly yesterday. A lack of support to a whole range of different services, but also the need for professionals to challenge, to go in and ask questions about what's going on here, has someone checked, what's the process. Okay, I probably need to speed up a little bit. We undertook, colleagues interviewed service providers to highlight some of the issues, and I'll just give these as kind of headlines. Accessibility remains a very significant issue. We've got an Equality Act that says disabled people have the right to equal support, and that public institutions should be planning for and anticipating disabled people using their services, and yet we know that most services aren't accessible to disabled people and remain inaccessible. So the quote here is around access to British Sign Language. There's also assumptions about disability and about violence against women, so perhaps not thinking about hidden impairments, only responding to people who are obviously disabled, but also assumptions about what vulnerability means to those women, about the type of relationships they have, about their status. So the quote here talks about a woman, sorry, on a large screen, from Nigeria who was trying to get housing, and she was presented as very vulnerable despite the fact she was in full-time work. She was doing a whole range of things. There were assumptions about what her relationship must be like because she's a disabled woman. One of the services that we talked to said actually a lot of the disabled women they talked to were sex workers, and again there simply wasn't an assumption that either disabled women would be sex workers or that sex workers were an appropriate group of people accessing services, or that someone highlighted about being in a same-sex relationship with their carer, an assumption services were making about whether that was an appropriate relationship or whether the abuse that was happening in that relationship was domestic violence, or I think the phrase they used in that was around it being carer strain. So an understandable response to having a partner who's a disabled person. But the second part of that quote I think is really interesting is it says she was dismissed as a nuisance by housing because her council property had been heavily adapted and it wasn't safe for her to stay there, and housing weren't really happy about it. They'd spent a lot of money and time making that building accessible for her. She needed to move to be away from the perpetrator, but there was a kind of a reluctance from the local authority to disinvest, if you like, the money that they'd spent. There was a real highlighting about things work well when services work together, and none of this is very new or very surprising, but again, what we know is it continues to happen. Really good outcomes happen when services work together, but in general, they don't work very well together in terms of being multi-agency interactions. Service providers tended to be less good at valuing and respecting the knowledge and lived experiences either of practitioners who brought that lived experience to their work or of the disabled women. So we've highlighted that as an area that they certainly needed to work on. And a tendency not to see the intersection with other forms of barriers, so around gender, around sexuality, race, ethnicity, other types of status. So the quote here is from a safeguarding duty worker who said they were supporting a physically disabled survivor who had no recourse to public funds because of their immigration status. They said, I don't think it was legal, but it wasn't safe to leave her where she was. So there's often tensions for organisations to be clear about who they should be working with and on what basis. In terms of what disabled people want, disabled women want, this didn't surprise us at all. It very much echoed the findings we'd had anecdotally from women themselves. They want stable, safe and accessible housing, that the lack of provision for housing was a particular issue for that, highlighting things like the extra labour and emotional cost of having to reorientate yourself to a new physical location. So, for example, someone with a visual impairment moving to a new geographic area has to spend a lot of time learning how to be independent in that space, and moving frequently is an even bigger challenge for that woman than it would be for a woman without sight loss. And that there tended to be a lack of support to help people integrate into new spaces when they moved. So that planning for safety and support planning is a really important part of working with disabled women, as is focusing on wider communities and access to networks. So how do we ensure that when disabled women move geographically, that they can establish new networks and access to the community in a way that is very difficult. And there was a tendency to focus on adapting houses in terms of physical access to make it accessible for the woman to live in, but without thinking about how accessible the community around them was. It might be a very physically inaccessible neighbourhood. Often they're neighbourhoods with lots of other problems that make it very easy to be isolated. Often it would be the run-down areas of town where there's drug use, where there's perhaps more violence, that makes it much harder for women. Women highlighted that resisting isolation is probably one of the strongest protective factors for them in terms of violence and abuse, and that those sort of pro-social relationships with family and friends was really important. So how we make sure services support and enable those relationships to continue by not moving people away from their networks. But also when people have a lack of networks because often they've been institutionalised, how do we enable them to develop those relationships when they move to a new area? And finally, as the women talked to us before we started the project, peer support was highlighted as really important. So women spending time with other women who'd experienced violence as groups of survivors, as a form of sharing experiences, sharing knowledge, but also about solidarity and support and of being around people that have very much experienced the same thing as they have. So the last quote on the slide talks about going to my sister's place, which is a project for women who've experienced violence. And what they liked about it being called My Sister's Place was that you could talk about it in conversation and no one knew it was a service or a special space that was available. It just sounded like you were going to your sister's house. But they talk about it being normal and not a project. There was another slide where a younger woman talked about going to meet with the older women who used the project. And it was reciprocal. Services thought it was good for this woman to be spending time with older people and being able to do something that was reciprocal. The older women thought they were supporting this woman to talk to other people. So it worked really well for both areas, and it kind of had a really strong element of reciprocity. So, last slide, you'll be very pleased to know. One of the elements that was really important to us about this project and that the drill funding enabled us to do was to be really focused on delivering change from what we'd learned. Too often in research we're funded to find out what works, what doesn't work, how things could change. And then it kind of is a cliff edge. We might produce a report, we might, hopefully if our funders let us, go to a conference, present the work. But often there isn't much opportunity to do anything beyond that. So it was a real privilege that we had funding to work on a best practice toolkit, which will be published in the next month, that provides this information in an accessible way and provides checklists for different providers to think about how they can change. We were funded to have a project conference, to run a number of workshops for professionals and service providers, to embed our learning in particularly our social work programmes at Lancaster, and to be funded to produce the research in a range of accessible ways for particularly disabled women to be able to access the information. So I know I've shared an awful lot with you, but I wanted to give you an overall sense of what the project was, but also about how it being a co-produced project and particularly funded by the drill stream really opened up some really positive opportunities for us. Thank you.
Okay. So raise your hand if you have a question, and so we'll see how many we'll take. We'll gather a few together. Is that okay? So who has a question? I have Andrea. Oh, maybe. We think about you, Ronnie. What is your name? Smada. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. So we have Andrea, Neely, Ronnie, and Smada. We'll collect the questions and try to have them answered together.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I also thought it was important that you gave the case. I thought it was important that in one of the cases that you presented, there was a perpetrator, a case, was also a disabled person. And when we think about violence and disability, we almost never think about having people that are violent, that they are disabled, and not only being the victimizers, the victims. So, and I think it's a hard conversation to have, because people that are violent more often are the victims, for sure. We need to have more services and more conversation to acknowledge it and to give better service. But what are we going to do with the hard conversation that people with disability are sometimes the victimizer, or maybe they are both, as you said. So how in this research or other research you conceptualize it, or what do you think need to be done in both of those cases?
שירי, הרמקול הוא חזק. זה לא רמקול.
זה מכשיר FM.
יש לנו פה את ה...
I'm not sure it's working, is it?
I'm sorry, I can't hear the question. Thank you.
Smadar wants to ask about the abuse in hospitals. Abuse of social workers.
עכשיו שומעים.
in the group between of them because of they don't have any place to speak about it, to give the help with the problem. I just now coming from one of the hospitals with abuse from the hospital. If you can speak a little bit around this problem.
So Smadar was asking, speak up Bernard. Smadar was asking about abuse that is possible from hospital staff as well as abuse from on the part of social worker themselves that might be part of the problem of causing the abuse. And who else did I promise?
Thank you. I think it's the other one actually.
Oh, is this one?
Okay. So I was just wondering whether, with regard to these cases of neglect and abuse within institutional settings, just for your thoughts, because you've been working on these issues for many years, I know, and we've had this long-standing, I think, debate. Is it a few bad apples? Do you know this? Is this a translatable? Or is there?
We have a lot of apples.
So is it a few bad apples, Hannah, or is there some broader process at work here that is either allowing it to happen or creating a problem? I'd just love to hear your observations.
One time.
So, yes, it's a general question, not necessarily regarding your research, but maybe also, could you talk a bit about the relationship or the collaboration between disability study research, or even more important, user-led research, and governmental authorities? What are the difficulties or the risks or the constraints that governmental authorities, especially when they are the funders, put on conducting disability research or disability study research? And thank you for the presentation.
I'm going to go backwards. Yeah, and I think it's telling that both the Creating Independent Futures project that I worked on and the Draw project were National Lottery funded. And I think the National Lottery has been quite forward-thinking in the sort of research it's willing to fund. I think we've seen a lot less of that from governments. It'd be interesting to see what Tom thinks, because he's funded to do research in international development, and I think in some ways there's a more positive experience in terms of doing research overseas than there is in the UK. I think there's probably a tension because the sort of research that disabled people's organisations want done at the moment highlights problems with government policy. They want to highlight the impact of benefit reform, of cuts to services, and that's not evidence government wants to hear. And I think there's also tensions. We have a very strong emphasis on evidence-based practice, but government again is quite selective about which source of evidence it wants to listen to and why. There's both a hierarchy, but also some areas where it doesn't seem to matter that there isn't evidence. So I think it's tricky. It's to be grappled with. I think certainly most of our funding would come from research council, so it's government funding, but often it's one step away. There is funding that you would get directly from government departments. That's less likely, I think, the sort of research I would do. I've been very lucky to be commissioned directly by local authorities who wanted us to do critical research, although there are still tensions there, in the same way that Tom highlighted about working with user-led organisations. It's my job to be critical. And they're often very enthusiastic about what they're doing. It's making good progress. They want to move quickly. And often I say we have to slow down. We can't produce good research evidence. We can't theorise. We can't think about this effectively unless we do it more slowly. And of course there's a tension for organisations that see that what they're doing can make a positive difference to people's lives. There's a whole range of different tensions within that. I think the question about abuse in hospitals and institutions kind of comes together. Yes, we've got lots of evidence in the UK that particularly disabled and older people experience abuse, much of which isn't intentional, but some is in institutional settings. And while there are certainly individual bad apples, and they get a lot of attention and often drive a lot of change, I think the bigger issue, and the one that we're less good at addressing, or better at highlighting it, we haven't entirely figured out how to address it, is the violent nature of institutions. Institutions by their nature are violent, whether that's about having to get up at certain times or work in certain ways, right through to very deliberate forms of violence which lead to significant harm or death. And I think there is something about the larger an institution gets, the more likely that is. I think it's more likely when there's a lot of money involved. So we're seeing the privatisation of a lot of health. Our research units looked a lot at the experiences of people with learning difficulties who are in secure settings. So there's the example of a young woman, and my work tends to be with adults. She's 17, but she's been in what's called an assessment and treatment unit. It's funded by the local authority, by the Health Trust, to a private organisation that pays £13,000 a week for her provision. That's a lot. Times that by about 4.5 to make things. That's a lot of money. And yet she lives in a cell. It's locked. In general, her meetings happen through a hatch. They pull a hatch down and food is given to her. Her father often has to speak with her through the hatch. She had, I find this very difficult, she had a pen. She self-harms, so I'm not saying that this is all bad. She managed to insert a pen into her arm, and it was there for a number of weeks because the services didn't know how to deal with it. When her father visited her recently, she was in her locked room and they couldn't open the door. Now this is it's like the equivalent of a prison that couldn't open its doors. Now this is a young woman who self-harms, who potentially tries suicide. It took them an hour, I think, half an hour to open that door. So even though it's a specialist service that you can't say £13,000 a week isn't well resourced, people are still experiencing the violence of that, and those numbers aren't going down. They stay about the same. We've got about 3,500 people living in that kind of setting, and despite an awful lot of political will and attention, those numbers haven't changed over the last few years. So there is something, particularly when there is profit involved, I'm afraid, because increasingly those types of hospitals are funded by venture capitalists who want to make a lot of money. There isn't an incentive to reduce the level of surveillance or the level of restraint that people experience. First question was about perpetrators. There is a literature, particularly about people with learning disabilities and people with mental health. We know they're both overrepresented in the general prison population that doesn't address the issues of them being disabled people. Particularly secure settings over-respond often to some of those issues. Particularly people with learning difficulties and men with learning difficulties are identified as perpetrators, so often around sexual offences that perhaps with appropriate sexual education and support wouldn't have become offences. Now that's not to say individual disabled people don't commit and perpetrate violence, clearly they do, but there are also factors that might live. If you were living in that locked ward, I'm pretty sure I'd be violent. So often it might be about situational responses that we need to be more accountable about. And families are messy. You know, most of our friendships and family lives are complicated, and relationships can become abusive either deliberately or because of the tensions that are put upon them. And they are very difficult conversations to have with people. I don't think I mentioned it, but I think one of the points we put on the slide was around routine inquiry, so that when services are talking to people, whether that's violence services or kind of traditional services around social care, that we ask people about violence, that we give them an opportunity to disclose and to talk about that, because we don't. And it was interesting, I did a project around sight loss and substance use, alcohol and other forms of substances, and again there wasn't routine asking. Social care services don't ask people about their use of substances to get a sense of whether it's problematic. Substance use services don't ask about whether you've got an impairment that might influence how you use that service. So just having some fairly, that's not a complicated, expensive thing to do, to make sure that as a matter of course we raise, or at least give people the opportunity to raise some of these issues that doesn't make it more difficult. So I think that was all for...
ממש 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 בקצרה ביותר.
I was sure that this question is going to be asked, so I mean, most of the people, or a lot of people here are students, and I mean, let's be frank, it's very important. I mean, it's what we should do. I mean, doing user-led research, but isn't it like dangerous? I mean, more complicated, and somewhere on the way you're gonna have it's gonna go wrong with the organization, and you're gonna say, I mean, why was I idealistic and just went my own way?
I think there are two parts of that. I mean, dangerous isn't the phrase I'd use. I think there are, if we talk about emancipatory research being a moral horizon, I think we have to be realistic about different points at which it's much easier later in a career to spend time developing a relationship with a user-led organisation and to invest some of my paid time in building that relationship. I'm working with a student who's applying for funding for her PhD, and she wants to look at experiences of people who identify as mad and disabled. And she's talking about doing user-led research, and I said, I don't think you can commit to all of this. You don't have the time, you don't have the financial backing to do that. So you might need to scale that back. It doesn't mean you can't use those principles as an aspiration to think about that. I don't think user-led organisations are any more necessarily tricky or problematic than any other potential partner. Working in partnership, whether it's with a service provider or whoever, is more messy. It's much safer to sit in the library and work with books. We know that, but it doesn't affect change. But my experience isn't. There might be maybe slightly different challenges, largely because user-led organisations are often poorly funded. They tend to have a lot less resource than the big charities, the big government departments. So that raises a number of challenges, but that's not about it being a disabled people's organisation. So I don't think there's anything inherently more problematic or difficult. But I also think in the gamut of disability research, we have to be realistic about where people are in career. If you're on a short-term contract, if you haven't secured funding, we have to be reasonable what we ask people to do and to support people to move. Academia in the UK is incredibly precarious for most people. And so to ask them to focus on perhaps producing accessible summaries when what we want in the job is an academic article is really hard. So we, particularly those of us who are in established careers who have permanent posts, have to work really hard to make sure that we enable people to do that work as far as possible. So we've started in our centre producing an easy read summary of all our reports and articles that are about people with learning difficulties, because we've just got about enough internal resource to feel we can commit to that. Ideally we'd like to do that for everything, but it's resource intensive to produce all of those, so it's an aspiration that we're moving towards.
This is what, okay, fine, okay. So just a short question, because I was a bit, I wondered about your definition of violence, because
it felt quite proud when you brought this story of, you know, at the edge of neglect, and so, and when you're saying that institutions are violent, yeah, hierarchy produce some kind of levels of violence, but so can you say just
It was really important for us, both in terms of the disabled people's organisation we work with, but also the work, there's a lot of work on violence at Lancaster, particularly around gender-based violence, that we took this very broad approach, that we moved beyond the very hard end of violence, if you like, to recognise that actually abuse and neglect are forms of violence, often on a continuum. And certainly our safeguarding legislation now allows us to do that and to see neglect as a significant form of violence that formally recognises institutional abuse. I wouldn't want to place them in a hierarchy. Obviously, if a woman's at immediate risk of being killed or of significant harm, you focus on that, not on the fact that you've got people living in institutions where perhaps long-term their health has been undermined because they're not weighed, they can't access a doctor. I don't think it's one or the other, because also we know the low-level stuff leads to the high-level violence. And we've just been really bad at looking at institutional violence. We've always assumed that violence is out there, it's bad people out there that are coming in and perpetrating, and not acknowledging that our practices, including bad apples in those institutions, perpetrate violence. But I know not everyone agrees with that perspective.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be introducing our next speaker as she comes up. So Nir Moser.
אין לאדם אחריות על הלקות שלו, אך יש לו אחריות גדולה כיצד הוא חי איתו. שלום רב, אני רותי כהן, עובדת בשטראוס 8.5 שנים, וגרה בדיור של ניצן כ8 שנים, ואני בעלת לקות למידה. אני לא מתביישת בזה, אבל ישנם אנשים רבים במצבים שמסתירים את זה ומתביישים בזה. בהרצאתי ארצה לספר על המסע האישי שלי מנכות לאיכות וממוגבלות למסוגלות. מסע לא שותף בית איזי שפירא, שמנגיש לאנשים עם צרכים מיוחדים שירותים ומעודד שילוב ואינטגרציה בחברה. אחת מהתוכניות שפועלות במסגרת בית איזי שפירא הינה האוניברסיטה המשלבת. דוקטור בני עוזמי הגה את הרעיון שאנשים עם צרכים מיוחדים יוכלו ללמוד לימודים גבוהים ולהשתלב בחברה. הוא בנה באוניברסיטה תוכנית דו-שנתית שמקנה לאנשים עם לקויות למידה כלים להשתלב בחברה ולבנות זהות של יכולת. בהמשך התפתחו קורסים נוספים, קבוצת קמח שהינה קבוצה מחקרית שעושה מחקרים על ועם אנשים עם צרכים מיוחדים. שום דבר עלינו בלעדינו היא הגישה שבבסיסה עומד הרעיון. אם בעבר הממסד קבע והחליט מה טוב לאנשים עם צרכים מיוחדים, היום האנשים הללו בעצמם שותפים לתהליך קבלת ההחלטות הנוגעות לחייהם. מה יעשו, כיצד יפעלו, והיכן יעבדו, היכן יבלו בשעות הפנאי והיכן ילמדו. המחקר המשתף אנשים עם לקויות למידה מורכבות בשיתוף פעולה עם חוקרים מנחים מטעם בית איזי שפירא, חוקרים יחד את הנושא של שיפור חייהם ושילובם של אנשים עם מוגבלות במרחב החברתי. האוניברסיטה המשלבת וקבוצת קמח הם חלק ממסע חיי, ובראש ובראשונה הקורס האומנות לחיות, מבוא לפסיכולוגיה מעשית. הרציונל של הקורס הוא שאנשים עם צרכים מיוחדים רוצים להיות משולבים בחברה. באוניברסיטה הרגילה הם לא יכולים להשתלב. ולכן האוניברסיטה המשולבת בנתה להם קורס מונגש. זאת אומרת, בשפה יותר ברורה, ללא מבחן, מעבר בסוף הקורס ועם כמה שפחות מתח ולחץ. הקורס האומנות לחיות הוא קורס דו-שנתי, והסטודנטים לומדים במושגים בפסיכולוגיה שמטרתם לתת כלים לשיפור הדימוי והערך העצמי, ובנוסף לשילוב בחברה. בשנים האחרונות אנחנו רואים שהיחס לאנשים עם מוגבלות עובר מגישה של חסד לגישה של זכויות. לאנשים עם מוגבלות יש יכולת להביע את עצמם, לבחור כמו כל אדם ולסנגר על עצמם.
סינגור עצמי זוהי היכולת של אדם לדבר בעד עצמו, לעמוד על מימוש זכויותיו כאדם, להחליט מה טוב עבורו, לקבל אחריות על החלטותיו. פעולה זו מתבצעת על ידי הפרט או הקבוצה עצמם, ומציגה את הצרכים המיוחדים כפי שהפרט או הקבוצה חווים אותם. מדוע אדם עם מוגבלות צריך לסנגר על עצמו? הרי אין לו אחריות על מצבו. המוגבלות היא עובדה נתונה, אבל החברה כל הזמן גורמת לו להרגיש אשם. במסגרת חברותי בקמח, הקבוצה החוקרת של האוניברסיטה המשולבת, ביצענו מחקר שמטרתו הייתה לבדוק כיצד לימודים במסגרת האוניברסיטה המשולבת בקורס האומנות לחיות משפיעים על הסטיגמה העצמית של האנשים שלמדו בו. סטיגמה עצמית היא מצב בו הפרט תופס את עצמו באופן שלילי על רקע של ביקורת, אפליה או השפלה שחווה במהלך חייו. עדיין אין ממצאים, אבל אני יכולה לשתף אתכם בדרך האישית שעברתי במסגרת לימודיי. לפני הקורס התביישתי בזה שאני לא מצליחה להתמיד בעבודה. לא הרגשתי נוח עם זה שאני עובדת רק 3 שעות ביום. היום אני גאה להגיד שאני עובדת בשטראוס כבר כמעט 8 שנים. הבנתי בקורס שידע הוא כוח, וכדי להבין מה הזכויות שלי אני צריכה לרכוש את הידע הזה. הכרתי אנשים ממסגרות שונות, מכל מיני מערכי דיור שזהים לאלו שאני גרה רק מערים אחרות. יצרנו קהילה שבה אנחנו מדברים באותה שפה, משתמשים באותם מינוחים. הלימודים גרמו לי לשים לב לשפה שבה אני משתמשת, והרי שפה יוצרת מציאות. אתן דוגמה קטנה להמחשה. אני לא אומרת יותר אדם שסובל ממוגבלות, אלא אדם שחי עם המוגבלות. הוצאתי את המילה סבל מהשיח. הלימודים גרמו לי לשנות את מיקוד השליטה שלי. במקום מיקוד שליטה חיצוני, עברתי למיקוד שליטה פנימית. זאת אומרת שאני אחראית למה שקורה לי ויוצרת את מה שאני רוצה שיקרה לי בחיים. אמנם אין עדיין תוצאות רשמיות למחקר, אבל זה לא משנה, כיוון שהגישה שלי השתנתה באופן כללי. עצם זה שיש לי אומץ לעמוד כאן מולכם, בלי להתבייש, ולספר כיצד התוכנית הזו משפיעה עליי, חיי, זו ההוכחה הכי חזקה להשפעה של הקורס עליי. יתרה מזאת, תקווה שלי היא שאני בהרצאה הקצרה הזאת תגרום לכם לשנות את הגישה ולחשוב אחרת על אנשים עם מוגבלות.
שאלות? אני חושבת שנעשה שאלות אחר כך בסוף לשניכם. בני עוזמי, Academic Director of Beit Easy Shapiro and Head of the Inclusive University Program, and he will complete. איך נוח לך יותר? עם זה ביד או עם זה?
אולי עם זה. לא, אני לא מספיק ארוך. All right, hi. What a challenging hour, time of the day. I'll try to do my best. How many of you are familiar with the participatory action research? Most of you? All right, so there's no use of presenting my presentation today. So, no. So I would like to give the broader picture about Ruthi's description and how it all started. In ancient times, I used to work in a diagnostic center for people with intellectual disabilities and people with mildly low intelligence for the Ministry of Welfare. And I met hundreds of people who told me their own story. And I could sense that they're actually, in a way, the more they've been aware of their reality and abilities, the more they mourned about what they want to achieve in life. And literature is busy dealing with the chronic sorrow that Olshansky mentioned in 1962, if I remember well, about the sorrow that parents sense at every stage of the life cycle of the complete child they could have had at this stage of life. But I didn't meet much research about the way that people perceived their themselves and also their perception about the future. Some people are afraid to face the future and to dream. Some people had dreams, but as one of my students in the inclusive university said, I've been depressed for a very long time. So I went to my therapist and she said, you know what your problem is? You keep dreaming too much and too far. Don't dream and you won't be disappointed and you won't be depressed. So how can we live without dreams? This is our oxygen for life. And many of the people that I met in the diagnostic center told me that they're envy, they're jealous. When it comes to, sometimes they're the oldest and they keep saying, why won't I have an opportunity to have a family of my own? Why won't I be able to go to college? A very negative narrative about the future. So I realized that falling between the cracks is not funny or fun. Is not fun at all. So when I arrived to Beit Izi Shapiro, and I used to be the director of the Trump Institute, we hold courses to promote quality of life. We started with professionals. Then we realized that if we are looking for a social change, we cannot focus only on the professional community. We should also provide courses for parents. And later on, we realized that speaking about self-fulfillment of people with disabilities, self-determination of people with disabilities won't happen if they won't be partners for the academic dialogue, academic knowledge as well. They have to be exposed to academic knowledge, they have to be part of it, they have to participate. So we started with a program that we called, at that time, the Special University. Today it's not politically correct, it's not special anymore, it's inclusive. So now it's called the Inclusive University. And when we decided to start the first course at Bar Ilan University, many people, like service providers, looked at us as lunatics, and they said, oh, we don't like faking reality. Okay, it's going to be fake university, an as-if university. And at the first place, I was furious. I got furious. I said, how dare you? Okay. But later on, I realized that that was the best gift that we could ever get, because they challenged us. And we realized that what we need is a cognitively accessible academy. We should take academic terms and simplify it. And if we do so, while doing so, we're actually gaining more partners. And that's what we started doing. So the first course was The Art of Living, an Introduction to Practical Psychology. And the aim in that course was to take topics that I've heard from people, needs that I heard from people, and try to meet these needs through the curriculum. So the major issue was Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm said that if you cannot love yourself, then you cannot genuinely love others. So the course is actually structured from 3 models. The first model is loving myself, not being in love in myself. Okay, this is a category in the DSM-5. No, but loving myself, appreciating myself. Being aware of my capabilities. Some people come to the interview and I say, what can you say about yourself? And they say, I'm ADHD. And I say, wow, pleased to meet you. I'm overweight. They say, oh, why do you say so? And I say, why do you say so? Let's start again. Okay? I'm Benny, and I'm the academic director of Beit Izi Shapiro. And who are you? I'm Moshe, and I work in the Super Fund. And they love me so much that I took a year off work and then they asked me to come back. I say, oh great, that's a good start. Okay, so the first module of the course actually challenges us to shift mode of thinking. Instead of putting the disability in the front of my identity, it's being part, a small, shrinked part of my identity, and I decide where to put it. Why do I say I decide where to put it? Because when I go to demand my rights, it should be in the front. Okay? When I go to the national security, okay, it should be in the front. But afterwards, I can put it way back. Okay, I don't need it anymore. So this is the first step. The second step is loving others. Okay, and this module actually focuses on social skills, social acceptance, and cognitive psychology, because people come with schemes about themselves. I'm bad, I'm a loser, okay, and we need to rethink the way we perceive ourselves. Assertiveness. And the third focuses on positive psychology, happiness, and looking at the future more confident. Now that I love myself and I'm equipped with skills to socialize with others, what next? So after 2-3 years, we realized that if we don't want it to be an as-if academy, then we should include research. And as we say, great minds think alike. One of the students, when we were just thinking about it, one of the students went to his break to the cafeteria, and he came back. It was actually a she. She came back and she said, do you think that these students, typical students, can be our friends? Not just being nice to us, be our friends. And I said, I'm not sure, I don't know. Let's check it out. And that was the first research that we held, okay, in the Art of Living course. And it actually tried to characterize self-acceptance among adults with what we call in Israel complex or significant learning disabilities. This is not intellectual disability, okay? It's learning difficulties more than, okay? As opposed, or with comparison to social preference among typical students. And what we found out is that students with significant learning difficulties adore independent friends, because independence is the major issue. But when it comes to typical students, independence is taken for granted. So they adore clever mates, clever friends. This way they can copy the assignments, easily, and etc. So this really encouraged us to continue the research, because we realized we just wanted, to present research methodology in general, but our students actually spoke the language. And we realized that we can benefit a lot from this kind of dialogue, because they give us perspective that we lack. But it took a lot of time, the process of research is very long and demanding, and it took a lot of time from the course itself, so we had to spread it, and that's how we established Kemach. קמח.
מה זה קהילה?
קהילה, מה? איפה? קמח, קבוצה מדעית חוקרת. קמח is, in Hebrew, it's the initials of an inclusive scientific research group. Okay? And in this group, we gathered, okay, I don't like the word selected, but yes, okay, you understand what I'm saying. Selected graduates of the Art of Living course who spoke the language and spoke the theory, and they decided what researchers they want to hold on. So they came up with issues like intimate relationships. They decided to write a research on the characteristics of the friendly employer. Why do people employ people with disabilities as opposed to people or employers who reject the idea? One of the findings, just to give you a sense of the dialogue with the co-researchers, in one of the sessions, Dr. Dana Roth, who supervised or facilitated the whole process, said, okay, you see what we found? We found that when you are given a chance, employment-wise, you take it seriously and you show what you can. Because you come to work every day on time and you're very talented there. So you show your employers what you can do. And they said, no. We come to work on a daily basis not because we enjoy work or because we sense that we are fulfilling ourselves through work. We do that because we don't have a guide, yeah, or a caregiver, or someone to look after us in the facility that we live in during the day. So since we lack this person, okay, and role for 8 hours between 7 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, our only option is to go back home if we get fired, and we don't want to get fired. So we keep doing the boring work that we have been given mercifully, okay, on a daily basis, but we don't really like it, okay? Can we imagine working 45 years in a job that we are given and we have to be grateful for without feeling that it's significant for us? What a waste of life. It's a good reason to mourn about our lives. Another issue was quality of life. And that was 9 years ago. The Director General of one of the association in Israel came to Dr. Dana Roth's office and said, I want you to make a research and find out whether my people are happy. End of quote. Okay, he's running, so to speak, an institution and supported housing in the community for people with intellectual disabilities. Their ability ranges from profound intellectual disability up to mild or borderline intelligence. So Dana and myself were looking at each other and we said, first of all, what is quality of life? We have theory. We all know Bob Scheller, okay, but does his philosophy fits their philosophy? So we said, you know what? We need a focus group. Okay? Please host us. We want to get to know the service users. We want to have a thorough conversation with them, and later on we can decide whether we can or not. Now, we have been introduced to the old methodology of participatory action research, and we knew what we need to do. But simplifying it to people with intellectual disabilities was quite a challenge. So we didn't want them to become biased to the research. So we asked them, what is the most important thing in life? So they kept saying family, friends, etc. Then we tried to shrink it, okay, to 6 dimensions, 8 dimensions. And then we showed them the 8 dimensions of quality of life, of shallows. And we asked them, do you agree with him? And they said, in general, yes. It covers all what we thought about. As we say, great minds think alike. Then we showed them the questionnaire, the instrument of shallows. And he has a questionnaire which is adapted to people with intellectual disabilities. And they said, it's missing something here. And I said, what does it miss? And they said, what about the key? A key. We need a key. We don't have any private thing in this place. We don't have a key to our room. We don't have a key to a cupboard. We cannot store private things anywhere, being sure that no one will touch them. So please ask a question about a key. We held a focus group for the team as well, for the staff. And we also asked them, what do you think is most important in life, in general? What do you think that those people that you serve will say? These people that you serve will say. So they said that the most important thing for their dwellers, those who serve, will be food. So we came with the results to write a discussion in one of our meetings with the research group, and we asked them. We said, you see, these are the findings. Major findings were that people with moderate to low intellectual disability accepted the lack of independence. They said, the staff protect us. They protect us. The staff members protect us. So it's understood why they should decide for us. But those with mildly to moderate intellectual disability, he said, no, we want more independence. We want more independence. And they gave an example. One of the members in the group said, first he opened the door just to make sure that the staff were not listening to what he said. The discussion was held in Bekizi, at the Trump Institute. And he said, we went on a cruise. So one of the, no, not the staff, one of my friends, okay, he's not his friend, okay, one of the residents. One of the residents touched someone, touched a girl at the disco. So the staff, the senior staff member said, everyone back to the rooms. And he said, why? Policy should distinguish between people who are high functioning and those who needs more supervision, guidance, and being looked after. But they cannot have one policy for all of us. Okay? Another girl said, it's not a matter of black and white. They don't give us money. We cannot decide what to buy. So I understand, if I want to buy myself a bed, they can say, no, you cannot afford this. But if I want to buy myself ice cream, I want to have pocket money. So I asked them, how much will be sufficient? They said 20 shekels. Okay? About 4 pounds, right? 20 shekels per week. Just to decide for ourselves. We cannot decide who to live with, who to share our private room with, private space. And we want to decide who's going to be our roommate. So then we confronted them with the findings about the priority that their staff set for them. And we said, you said that the most important component in your quality of life is family and friendship, friends, making friends. And your staff member said that you will think that food is the most important thing in life. And they said, oh, that's easy to explain. And we said, why is it easy to explain? And they said, because when do the staff members meet us? Around meals. So they say, please prepare this, make the table, do the dishes. And they don't really see us at work. They don't see other fields that we contribute to society. So that's the way that they see us, through meals and food. But this is not reality. Okay? So this was eye-opening. The whole discussion, their inputs, have been very unique, and we realized that any academic researcher cannot tune in this depth, okay, and think about this way of thinking. Only people who actually sense reality can explain reality in a genuine way. And to be honest, when we hold the research and we come to the discussion is actually trying to explain the findings. And it's again assumptions, okay, that are based on a theoretical literature, etc. Here we are more flexible. When we hold a participatory action research, we are more flexible, okay? We honor the co-researchers' remarks. We document every single word because it explains the findings in the best way. And we could never tune in and think the way they think. All right, so I'll skip this. And I would like to refer to the strengths of the inclusive research as opposed to the challenges. So as for the strengths, the major contribution is the issue of perspective. I think that we have a much more full idea, picture, when people who actually experience reality, explain reality, and try to set terminology and to build the instrument and to ask the right questions. Okay? They also give us an idea about the ability of the subjects in the research. Will they be able to answer these questions? Is it clear enough? Okay? So they help us to access it, actually, for those who are going to answer these questionnaires as well. The challenges are, it takes time. It takes time. So if we want to produce articles, okay, then this is not the right thing. Okay? If we want to change reality, then this is the right thing. Why? Because the co-researchers are actually so devoted to the topic, to the issue. They want to see, they don't want just to hold a research, they want reality to change, and they're committed. So they're actually doing their best. There are two issues that they are not really full partners, and one of which is the statistical analysis. Okay, and I know many academics, okay, that do not do the statistical analysis for themselves. It's been mediated by more talented, or I don't know, peers. Okay, and I'm one of them. Okay, so this is one issue. The other issue that they are less involved is integrating the whole material, okay, the literature and the findings, and writing the actual article or chapter, because everything is published in Sola, okay, Everything is published, and the works are presented in conferences, and I think that it is a very empowering experience for everyone. Okay, not just for people with disabilities or intellectual disabilities or challenges, but for all of us. Okay, because sometimes we have to take our professional prestige. Okay. Put it aside and remember that we're all human. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benny. Stay up here for questions, don't run away. רותי, תצטרפי אלינו. רותי. Ruth. So we do have some time for questions, and thank you to both of you. I want to say, if I can, to add from my personal experience, because I've actually had some contact with the... Sorry. I've had some contact with the research group that Benny and Ruti are a part of, and I finished a research study, and then I came to discuss with the group the results. And the results of the study, in short, weren't not what I had expected to find. And they were funded by no, I was not going to say a name. I was going to say they were funded by someone who might have been very disappointed at what my results would show. So I come to the group and I tell them very frankly, listen, I must explain these results somehow. Please try to offer me an explanation that I could come up with. And at the end, in the discussion that I had written, the group actually is very much part of the discussion that I was writing, because their explanation really made sense for the study, and it became an integral part of explaining what I had found there. So this was my experience, and we continue to do research with the group together. And thank you for sharing with me.
Now our group is a branch, okay, of the Center for Disability Studies, and Shirley is a co-facilitator in our group. And thank you, Shirley.
Thank you. So who wants to ask a question? Groups. Yeah, if there are people that have not asked before, and I would give them priority. Exactly.
You can also ask me.
Right. If someone is shy from the English, Hebrew is fine.
Sola.
I have questions. I have asked.
Write your name in any case. Angerad. Someone else?
השאלה שלי היא גם לרותי וגם לבני, לכן אני שואלת אותה באנגלית, בעברית, סליחה. בני, בהרצאה שלך אתה אמרת שכשהתחילו את קמח, בחרתם אנשים שמדברים את השפה. אם אתה יכול להרחיב על זה קצת, מה הכוונה מדברים על השפה? והאם יש קשר בין השפה הזאת לבין המונחים שנלמדו בקורס על אומנות החיים, פסיכולוגיה שימושית?
Translate. So Sola was asking that Benny in his presentation said that people who were in the group were people who, quote, knew the language. So she was asking how he selected these people who knew the language and did they might have learned it.
No. What do you mean by use the language? What terms, what kind of discourse? Did you indoctrinate some kind of an opinion through the course so that the people part of the Kemach should know and use in order to be part of the research? Is it kind of a way of thought that you must have in order to be a part of the research?
I will take a few questions.
First, I like to say לרותי, תודה, 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 כאישה נכה. זה לא פשוט שעמד פה והוצאת סיפור החוצה. בגלל זה אמרתי את החלק הזה בעברית, שרותי גם תוכל להבין, כי התודה הענקית היא אלייך, בעיניי אתה כוכבת יותר מבני, למרות ששניכם יחד. ואני מדברת מלב של אישה נכה. זה לב שונה לדעתי מלב של אדם בריא, אם יש דבר כזה בעולם בכלל. והשאלה שלי אליך, בני, לאיזה קבוצות נכות מכוונת האוניברסיטה הזו? האם זה מכוון גם לנכי נפש שקשה להם מאוד להיקלט בחברה, ואולי זו הנכות מבחינה חברתית הקשה ביותר? כאשר קוגניטיבית הם יכולים להיות במצב מאוד גבוה, אבל הם לא מתמודדים עם מה שקורה מבחינת בחינות, לחץ, החברה, קבלה חברתית. לפעמים רואים את זה יותר עליהם, אז זה יותר קשה. כשלא רואים, אז איך אני מסתיר את זה? והנכויות הפיזיות שהן שונות, וכשאפרת הובילה אותי הבוקר לפה, אמרתי לה, אני מתפעלת לראות את הנגישות באוניברסיטה העברית, כי לפני 40 שנה זה פעם האחרונה שהייתי פה, ואני אחת שנלחמת מאוד על נגישות, ולא בכל מקום יש את הנגישות, כולל גם אם אתה משתף את הפעולה עם בר אילן, בבר אילן אין כל כך הרבה נגישות הזאת. אז איך גם אלה משתלבים מעבר, כי הבנתי כביכול, שבהתחלה התכוונתם יותר לנכות קוגניטיבית.
That's fine. The question was, is there a specific type of a disability group that the group is aimed at, and how do people with other types of disabilities fit in? For example, people with psychosocial disabilities and people with physical disabilities that many times have to fight their way for accessibility and other issues, and how do they get their way? And I think we might do this and then open up a larger discussion.
All right, so I'll refer to the first question, Sola's question about what is speaking the language. Okay, so we did not choose the members of KEMA, the member of the scientific group. They've not been chosen based on the language that they spoke, okay? What I said is that when we started teaching research methodology in the course of the art of living, we thought that it would be a very exclusive language that will arouse anxiety among our students. And no, they spoke the language. So, the language of research. Not necessarily statistics, but, you know, understanding the structure of the research, understanding what a research hypothesis is. They actually held a collaborative discussion. Yeah, it was a surprise because there are people who are perceived as people who did not experience success in high schools. Some of them even did not finish, you know, matriculation exams and diploma. And it encouraged us, okay, because yes, we were surprised. In 2004, we were surprised. Today we take it for granted, okay? And we think that in order to hold a collaborative discussion, if the members lack this language, okay, we need to mediate it. We need to give them a structured, fast, rapid course with the general topics of research, because otherwise the discussion will be an excluding discussion. We have our own language as facilitators. You have your language. You give us what you can. We need a common ground of terminology and knowledge. בטח.
למשל אנחנו יושבים בשיעור תיאטרון בכל יום ראשון, יש לנו תיאטרון קהילתי, ואז מדברים על איזשהו נושא, ואז פתאום נזכרים אצל בני למדנו על מאסלו, או אצל בני למדנו על אריקסון, או שאנחנו יושבים בקבוצת קמח ופתאום אנחנו נזכרים באיזשהו משהו שבני אמר. זה כאילו הופך להיות איזשהו משהו משותף לכולנו, לאיזשהו שיח משותף, שרק מי שבאמת למד אצל בני, וככה זה גם כאילו עבר, כאילו ככה זה עבר מאחד לשני. גם אני רוצה לדעת בעצם מה למדנו אצל בני, וכאילו להיות שייך לקבוצה הזאת שלמדה אצל בני. ולזה מה שהתכוונתי כשאמרתי שיש לנו איזושהי שפה משותפת, או איזשהו משהו שהוא מאוד מאוד משותף.
And Ruti's group actually wrote a play about aging with intellectual disabilities. So one day they came to the research group and they said the next research that we're going to write will be on aging, because this is something that we find interesting. And
aging.
Aging is aging. And I said, okay, so let's start discussing aging. And they said, no, no, no. First you have to come on the 8th of March to see the play. And then you can select, we can select major themes, okay, major themes in the play, on which we will structure our instrument. And that was brilliant. And I said, what is the most important thing? When you think about aging, what's the most important thing? And they said, let's go back to Erickson. What does Erickson says? The 8th stage is satisfaction versus despair. So let's check what is satisfaction among adults with intellectual, not intellectual, learning disabilities, as opposed to typical aging people. What is satisfaction? What is the sense of living full life for both groups? And let's compare it. So that's brilliant, because their hypothesis is based on a previous knowledge that they've been exposed to and remembered 6 years after finishing the program at Bar-Ilan University. So it's not an as-if university. Okay, it's a genuine university, and they're genuine students. And as for the characteristics of the students in the inclusive university, it varies. Okay, the first session that I meet the group, I say, okay, so why do we have this program? And why do you sit here? Because you're all people with learning disabilities, right? They say, yes. This is a program for people with learning disabilities, right? They say, yes. And I say, wrong. Why have you been interviewed? Do you think that I ask you, have you got learning disabilities? You're accepted? No, I kept asking you about challenges and how you overcame challenges in life and in school in the past. And what do you think your strengths are? The whole dialogue was different. So you've been chosen because of your learning abilities. And our duty is to mediate the knowledge for you, the curriculum for you. And they sit on the chair like this because it's a reframing. Okay? So, many, I mean, we know that learning disabilities are part of some other disabilities as well. People with CP, okay, are not associated with learning disabilities, but about half of the population also is challenged by learning disabilities. People with other neurological issues, okay? And some of our students are also students that graduated university, but they said that they graduated university with the wrong degree, and they want a degree for life, okay?
שאלה קטנה, יש עוד קורסים באוניברסיטה ולפי, other courses in the inclusive university, and how the themes for the courses are chosen?
So if I have to describe the structure of the inclusive university, it's like a pyramid. The foundation, the baseline, is the art of living, an introduction to practical psychology. The second layer is continuing education, because many graduates of our program said, is that it? That's our allowance, 2 years of academy, and what if we want more? So we established the unit for continuing education, and they have a taste of law studies, medicine studies, and even economics, okay? And Ruti participated in, I think that she's a chronic student of the continuing education. Yeah, and we brainstormed on our way here, and she gave me too many ideas, okay, that we need to sift and see what's to be planned for next year. But yes, the ideas for courses come from the students, because they know best what they need. And we try to shape it, you know, as a structure of the course. So that's the second layer, the continuing education. And then graduates said, why is it all segregated? Why is it not integrated? So we contacted the JDC in Israel, and which you're quite familiar with because you met the leaders of Ashalim, or Israel Beyond Disability. Unlimited. Okay. So they had a project that was called Friending, okay? And we had our inclusive university, and we said, why won't we have an academic friending? Full inclusion, full integration, 12 students of ours with 12 typical students will learn together, and some of our students can get accreditation for the course if they desire. They have to pay, you know, the university, but otherwise it's the same curriculum, same assignments, and the people, our students actually were capable of dealing with this challenge, and some of them continued to the tip of the pyramid, which is the new program, Being a Student. Also, it's a program of the JDC, Israel Unlimited, and it builds individual tracks for people, for students, adults, who really want to have a full degree or even a partial degree. When we go to high school, nobody promises that we'll have a matriculation diploma at the end. But we dare go in there. So we believe that the academy should not be an exclusive institution. People should dare going to academy, to college, and to achieve what they can. If it's accreditation for 1 or 2 courses, it's fine. It's fine. It's not either you have everything or nothing. You can achieve what you can. Okay, and we have to be flexible in the academy to enable these tracks as well.
Okay. Thank you again, Benny.
Thank you.
Go ahead. May I? Because you're our guest.
Thank you. Ruki, I wondered whether I might ask a question to you. Okay. So you're now a very experienced student. What makes a really great university teacher?
היה לנו שיעור כזה, בין השיעורים הראשונים שבני, בין השיעורים הראשונים שלמדנו עם בני זה היה המורה הטוב והמורה הרע, ובעצם הוא נתן לנו לעשות רשימה של תכונות שאנחנו נזכר מי היה המורה הטוב שלנו ומי היה המורה שלא כל כך אהבנו, וראינו כאילו איזה תכונות.
We're trying to be I'm not the only lecturer.
הוא המורה הטוב.
No, you don't have to talk about that.
Yeah, but we're trying to be the good teacher, and they tell us what's good and what's bad.
Yeah.
אתם רוצים לראות? יש את זה על טבלה. אפשר לראות טבלה? טבלה? אוקיי.
Because you asked, they were planned ahead and they have a table with the characteristics.
This was not planned.
No, this was not planned, but It was not planned, but always, everybody always has a discussion with everything that the group works on, just in case. So.
אוקיי, אז אני רק יצא להיכנס לזה, אני לא יודע איך אני נכנס לדיסק-און-קי שלי.
תפתח ממש כאן USB Drive למטה.
איפה?
יופי, כן, הנה נפתח.
נפתח, אוקיי, גוד. מצגות הוראה, למידה מהי. מצגות הוראה. תעזרו לי למצוא את זה, למידה מהי. מהי למידה, למידה מהי, ומלמד.
מהי למידה?
Okay, this is actually a base of knowledge that was developed. Yeah, okay, שנייה. נמצא את זה. Oh, here. Okay, you won't be able to see it, but I'll mediate. This is actually a base of knowledge that they structured, the students structured. So it's not a formal research, but the inputs are crucial for teachers and lecturers. And if we speak about universal design for learning, this is a must for everyone. So I realized that actually their remarks can be divided into 4 dimensions, okay? The characteristics of the good teacher, personal characteristics, pedagogical characteristics, the way that the teacher perceives the student with the learning disabilities, and the way that the teacher relates to the individual with learning disabilities towards his peers. Okay? When something happens, how does he mediate, okay, the crisis or whatever? So, personal characteristics. A teacher who is sympathetic, smiling, tolerant, a good listener, has good energies.
The vibes.
Okay. A teacher who is, first of all, a human being, a guiding parental image, supportive, keeps an eye contact when he talks to me and speaks in an eye level. Okay? A teacher who senses being a messenger, who perceives himself as a messenger, okay? And a speaker who has a very pleasant tone of speaking, okay? Pedagogical, okay, characteristics. Oh, this is something that I have to tell you. Do you have time? 5 minutes, 2 minutes?
I'm probably destroying the schedule, but that's fine.
Oh, it's fine, okay. You know, we know all the disses, but one of the less familiar disses is dysnomia, the ability to name things, okay? So one of our students, when I asked her, how was your bad teacher? It was a lecturer of ours who replaced me sometime. I was not feeling well. And I said, how was the lecturer? And one of the students said, she was like a sewage. And I said, wow, what an academic word to use at Bar-Ilan University. Biyuf. Jola. That's the term she used. Jola. Sewage. And I said, sewage? Okay. But it's worth waiting and mediating. So I said, what do you mean? And she goes like this. Let's imagine that in the morning you brush your teeth. That sounds really totally psychotic. And I say, yes, okay, let's pretend. And she said, okay, so you open the tap. And I say, yes. So when you open it strongly, what happens? Okay, everything is flooded. Sewage cannot swallow the water. Okay? So with me, it's the same. She was a good teacher, but she was speaking slowly, quickly. I couldn't swallow. I was like a sewage, like the drain.
Oh, sewer.
Sewage.
Right.
Sewer, right?
Sewer.
I couldn't absorb it. I didn't have time to absorb it, to process the material. She was good, but the rhythm was bad. So from she gave me a tip, because now when I speak slowly, so I enable myself, okay, to prepare or build the sentence. It gives me time, especially when it's in English, okay, and people can understand me, and I stop. A full stop is a full stop. It's sanctified, because this is the precious time that people can absorb what I'm saying.
I'll answer.
Okay, so the rhythm gives reinforcements, tells stories, okay, that connect between the theory and the relevance of the theory to our lives. Tell jokes, and I said, why is it important? Because, and they said, if we sense anxiety, our brains are blocked, okay, etc., etc. The way that he perceives the student, believes in me, okay, identifies my challenges, asked me how I felt before the session. How is everything going at home when he knew that I'm facing tough reality at home? Grisha, one of the students, said, I was not a friend of mathematics. I couldn't understand anything in mathematics. And the teacher used to put his hand here on my shoulder and ask me, Grisha, how is life? Is everything okay at home? And I knew that I had a deal with someone who cares about me. So I tried to recruit myself for the session, even though I understood nothing, I kept eye contact. Okay? Okay, and when it comes to my peers, he tells values, etc. The bad teacher, I said a negative teacher, because I also teach in the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox sector, and they said, don't use bad language. Okay, be more positive. So I said, Hamoreh halotov, the not good teacher, the less good teacher. Okay, so when it comes to his characteristics, judgmental, blocking, boring, lacking life, terrifying, rigid. Okay, when it comes to pedagogical issues, he cannot explain the material, speaks fast, punishes, he drives me into fails, shouts, hushes me when he doesn't have answers to my questions. Okay, teaches also when it comes to the break, he doesn't really respect our breaks, and he's not creative in teaching. The way he perceives the student, he's very rigid. He thinks about people in black and white. Either you're talented or genius or someone who should be ignored. Labeled me as problematic and sent me to a lower class to do my homework. First grade. He was in sixth grade, and he was sent to first grade. What an humiliation. And one educator, before resigning from Bar-Ilan University, going into pension, said, the challenge of a teacher is not to teach the material, is to increase interest in the material. And the big challenge is to make the student wanting to know more. The way that the teacher mediated towards my peers, he used to call me names, he used to call me to the board and humiliate me there, and he discriminated between the good students and the bad students, humiliation in general. So this is something that we try to avoid, and I think that this is the best gift that we've been given from our students. If we just, when we talk about UDL, we try to think what's the best thing to do it. We should ask the users, the students, those who get the service, what's best. And as I said, it's not a matter of humbleness. It's a matter of accuracy, okay? If we want to be precise in what we do, we need to consult with those who get the service, even when it comes to academy.
I think we can probably all learn from that list, actually. Thank you. Thanks, Ruby.
Thank you again. And thank you, Andrea, again, also. We've come to our end.
Why not?
We've come to the end, so it's time to thank all of you for coming to us.
For those of you who are from Israel, I assume and I hope I will see you next meetings that we have, and we'll put up Tom, I'm going to ask Andrea as well, is it okay to pass the people who are here the PowerPoint? Yes. Benny, is it okay to pass the people here? Wonderful. So we will have up I think it's about time that my English needs to stop. So we will be putting up Tamar's words as well as the slides and everything like that. So thank you everyone for coming. I want to thank Tamar, of course, for being with us thank the 4 of the speakers that were here. I think for me at least it was very eye-opening, very appreciate the chance to hear everyone. To thank Efrat for these few days. Give her the permission to go to sleep for about 5 additional days after this day.
I give you also permission.
And Tom and Agrad, by the way, Benny and Ruti, Hannah said sorry that she had to go out because she has to travel up north, so she's left us. And Tom and Agrad, we wanted to give you, because you came all the way here, just something small from Hebrew University. So it's 2 things that look the same except for one difference, and then you will pick the difference. So it's a Hebrew University cap. You both get one a cap. It's a Hebrew University pen for both of you. A social work, a chocolate medal. And, you know, a day book, but you need to write from right to left. Okay? If you don't see the soul. But you can read the direction. This is where the difference comes in, and you can fight over it. One of you will get dates. The other one, and I have a feeling who it's going to be, is going to get a really big chunk of halva.
For the rapidly expanding one.
You have to say.
Yeah, I think you won. We all understand why you won the halva. Yes.
Very sweet too. Well, this is very generous. Thank you.
Thank you for coming all the way to us. We know there are lots of people beyond our tiny group that really appreciated that you came to us. Thank you.
Thank you for your hospitality.